In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Laudetur Jesus Christus. This is Timothy Flanders at the Meaning of Catholic. I'm joined today by Mr. Ryan Grant. Ryan, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Doing very good. Happy to have you on. Mr. Ryan Grant is a Latinist and historian and president of Mediatrix Press. And today we're going to talk about the rise of the secular state. And but first, Ryan, what's new with Mediatrix Press? What's going on?
Well, we're currently trying to get a number of things out before Christmas, and so that's been kind of the round the clock. Both basically some translations of Bellarmine. There's a couple of surprises I haven't mentioned because I'm not sure I'll get them done, so I don't want to put them out there and say, "Hey, everybody, look at this," and then not have it. So, but the one thing that is kind of bedrock is going to happen is a translation of Bellarmine on the sacraments in general and on baptism and confirmation. So that's a little later than I wanted to get it, but it should be out in December. And so there's that, and there's a few other things, and just published a couple reprints, and so hopefully there'll be a lot more of that next year. And we do have a subscription service now, 2 tiers. So in one part of it, you get a hardcover book every month, plus all the content that we're trying to produce, which are little history things that I'll do, as well as some art. Renaissance art commentary, interviews, which we've been slow on this month because a lot of people have been busy, but hopefully get those out. So it's certain e-content plus all the ebooks, everything we have in ebook, you'll have access to. And then there's a lower tier where you get all the e-stuff, but not a book.
Excellent. Yeah. So the link is below. Everybody, make sure that you sign up. Don't miss out. Here are my favorite Mediatrix Press books: your translation of Alphonsus and the classic Franzlin text on divine tradition. Very important text.
Mind if I say something about that too? Because
go ahead.
I get a lot. Everyone who's a layman, doesn't have a PhD, basically, absolutely loves that book. Academics hate it, and they pound on it.
Oh, really?
Because it's too literal, they say, and they're right in a certain sense. So when I translated that, and actually that was the very first work I ever translated. I think Father Rippier commissioned me to do it. That's why he has the copyright. And then of course that I actually had to throw it out twice and completely redo it, because everything I was learning while I was doing it in terms of Thomistic terminology, scholastic uses, complicated technical terminology, and Latin theology. And that's actually how I learned a lot of that, was doing that work, finding out that I jumbled over these terms, and then had to go back and do it, and then looking at the entirety of the work. And like I said, at least once, and another time for a few chapters, I said, I'm just going to do this all over again. And so it is very literal, not absolutely literal, like word in per word, but it is more literal than a lot of academics would prefer to have things. And part of that is there's a certain, especially, people of, like I say, a Tübingen mindset. You want to take the older works and you want to put them through a certain lens. I noticed this when I was reading a book. I forget which one. I think it was Hans Kuhn. And so he translated this phrase from Lumen Gentium. It was way back when I was getting into things. He translated this phrase from Lumen Gentium. And it was just when I was getting started. I was in Steubenville. So there's this book that was on a subject that I was dealing with in Vatican II, and I was reading it. He translates this line from Lumen Gentium one way. And then later in the book, he takes the exact same line and translates it an entirely different way for a whole new line of arguments. I'm like, these guys are practically making things up as they go along. That was like 20 years ago or something like that. It was 22, I forget. But I was reading that. And I noticed that there's a certain current that likes, especially with the Roman school. Well, this stuff, we just can't take this stuff. We got to put it through a lens. So one of the negative commenters on the review of that Franzlin book, he basically says that, you should look at Cardinal Casper for how to read the Roman school. And then a priest wrote me and about that comment. He said, well, the fact that he referenced Casper, it means I got it. Your book's
right.
probably doing the right thing. The fact that he wants you to read Casper to figure out how to translate it right, which is twisted all around. And Congar does that too. Congar cites Franzlin, but makes him say something opposite of what he actually said. So that's why I am going to go through and do another edition of the book, because there are some things I was reading through it that could have been phrased a little bit better. We're a bit harsh, but anyway.
Well, that's great. I mean, we could do a whole show on the ways that translations have been misused in the 20th century, with before and after Vatican II. That's very good that you focused on that literal translation. It's an extremely good work for viewers, especially coming after the Second Vatican Council, when there's this exaltation of the papacy over the tradition, even. Which really comes into play a lot more in the 20th century, right. But very important work. But today's topic is the rise of the secular state. We live in the COVID 1984 era of the secular state, plus the imbroglio of the election that we're now dealing with. And I was trying to think of ways that the secular state of today is distinctly different from the states of Christendom. And I came up with 4. The secular state worships itself and its bloodshed with religious rituals. Meaning there's religious rituals of the state where they're not actually offering them to God. They're basically offering them to their own country. It has its own professional army, which is much more harkening back to the Roman Empire. It controls its citizens with the greatest power in history. I also thought of public re-education, sometimes forced, to replace the family. Does that pretty much do it for the secular state? I'm sure there's other distinct major things.
I think also the relationship with organized religion. That's also the big thing that gets refined and changes as things go. I guess first we should look at what secularism is. Now you read people today who support secularism or support all these things, and they like to say, well, Jesus was the first secularist. He said, render unto Caesar and render unto God what's God's, and it's 2 different separate things. But that's a really facile argument, because when you get down to it, these are the same people that are then saying, oh, the whole Middle Ages was a theocracy and all these things. And then suddenly, with the beginning of the Reformation, Henry VIII, they'd break that theocracy. And it's exactly the opposite. Henry VIII actually creates a theocracy. We'll get into that a little bit more too. So what properly then is secularism? Because in the Middle Ages, as we'll talk about, there is a distinction. I won't quite say separation, but there is a distinction of church and state, where each has their own sphere, and that it works like unto when people talk about certain degrees of separation, that the church is not governing the day-to-day life of the state, but it is informing the state. So the term secular from the Latin saeculum, which can mean the world. Literally means, like the age, right? And so you talk about seculars as in people who are in the world, like secular clergy, as in diocesan clergy and whatnot. But the term as it's implied, I believe, is Holbrook. Holyoke. I can't remember his first name, but in the United States, he's the first person to coin the term in English. Other thinkers in other languages might have come up with it earlier, for all I know, but he says secularism is essentially that the state interested only in the affairs of the state and nothing in the affairs of religion, right? And that's the way he drafts it. And for the most part, we can say that that's an accurate term, and we can use it. So secularism, as it arises in the European tradition, especially in the countries we're going to focus on, is more or less saying, because it happens in Catholic countries as well as in Protestant countries, and it even is a growing outgrowths of it, the roots begin in the Middle Ages. And so secularism is essentially where the state is going to order all the affairs of men, and all bodies within it, including the church and others, happen to be present within it, but it's the state that's the ultimate authority. And that's essentially what we would say. I think that would be how we would want to define secularism if we're comparing it to Christendom, where the state, not the church, is the ultimate authority in all things, even where the state and the church overlap.
Okay, so let's go back to just set the scene for us before Luther, 1517. You mentioned that there are precursors to secularism, because obviously there were wars, civil wars among Catholic powers before Luther, obviously, and there was also power grabbing by kings, certainly. But what really made the big difference in the way that states and societies were set up in terms of the power of the state before Luther?
So the way the state is set up prior to Luther, rising out of the fall of the Roman Empire and the need for security, the uncertainties of everything, is that you have essentially warlords who give security. To put everything to a more banal and somewhat anthropological historical sense, you have warlords that provide security, and people say this is good, and eventually they legitimize themselves by being consecrated by the church, or it's demanded of them, one or the other. So what happens is that you have the growth of larger and larger, areas on the descendants of those who have the same kind of relationship, in this feudal relationship. We provide you security, you give us stuff, whether that's crops or money or what have you. And as this order arises, there's new ideas in jurisprudence, there's new changes, there's new figures, there's new saints that change how those relationships are working on the side of the people. So you have the state on the one hand, which doesn't actually exist in the modern notion of it. You have all these competing systems of government. You have the king, and then in most places, and then you have the feudal aristocracy under the king, which might be relations, might not be, but they have their own territory. It's properly theirs as feudal nobles, and then there's people under them. Then there's other competing systems within this structure. There's guilds, there's merchant guilds, there's trade guilds, there's church guilds, there's artist guilds, there's what have you. There's the town council, the city council, which is not its own, like, as we think of the government today, when you go out and vote for mayor, it's actually like a corporation that runs the town. It's comprised of all the business owning and property owning gentry in the town, and even certain people of a certain status can petition to be on the town council. And they're so powerful that the Holy Roman Emperor has to sit down hat in hand to negotiate a treaty with this or that town, because they could, even though he could get all the troops together and mow them all down, they can put an army in the field and be significantly enough of an annoyance where he's not going to want to do that. So you have all these massively competing systems of government. Nobody has, if we want to borrow the libertarian language about the monopoly of force, nobody has the monopoly on force the way the modern state does. So that's kind of one of the differences. In the church is also a major power. Now the church isn't, except where you have like a prince archbishop, and even then it's still supposed to be somewhat, differentiated. The church doesn't have the govern the day-to-day life. It's mostly governing how things work in churches, bishops, benefices, how priests get paid, and things of this sort. But there are overlapping spheres between church and state where the church is at least supposed to be superior. So and you have a point where Pope Innocent III, more famously, he actually has the major monarchs in Europe all excommunicated at the same time. He goes into a contest with all three of them, and he wins. They all come to terms. They all, France, England, and the Empire, they all back down and accept Innocent III's, decisions in the matters that caused the conflict. So what happens, as wars go about, as national consciousnesses are being formed, you have kind of a change. The idea, the notion of being English, for example, you don't really have that in England until about the 14th century. And part of it's in language. And there's a lot of study in language that we could do episodes on that too, how language forms a culture and how it forms a people. And England, for example, is a country of many languages and cultures. You have, in the dialects within those languages, deriving back from Saxon times. And now you have the Angevin aristocracy, the Plantagenets, who speak French. And the English monarchs, actually, until Henry V, there's not a single one that speaks English. They all speak Anglo-French. Then and then Henry V also speaks Anglo-French. That little bit at the end of Shakespeare where he can't talk to the princess is totally nonsense, because he spoke French as his first language. But he did learn English, which was rare. It's added to his popularity, or at least what was English at that time. And then, things continue to develop that way. In France, you have like a pan-French language, and obviously your dialectical differences. But the monarch is gradually aggregating a little more power to himself, especially, and that's why you have the 100 Years of Conflict, because the King of England actually owned more territory in France than the King of France. And that's what develops the seedbed for those famous conflicts. Italy is terribly divided. Nobody thinks of himself as Italian, except when he's abroad. In Italy, I'm from Napoli, I'm from Milan, I'm from Rome, I'm from Florence, I'm from Padua, Ferrara, etc. I'm from these cities, and that's how you think of yourself, or your country town in between. You don't think of yourself as Italian. For that notion doesn't really exist. So gradually, these notions are starting to develop in different ways. Similarly in Germany too. Germany is a whole complicated thing. Anyways, we talk about Germany, Deutschland, right? It doesn't exist until 1870. There's no such thing as Germany.
Right.
Until 1870, there's German culture, German language, and that's the only identifying mark, very much like in Italy, which becomes a country around the same time, actually. So in Germany, you have the Holy Roman Empire, which is made of various states with various electors and various local feudal lords under it. And, you have various laws whereby the empire is supposed to function. And if you violate those laws, then you incur the Reichsbann and stuff. And we'll actually talk about that a little bit later in the 30 Years' War. But so the emperor is not this absolute monarch of the Holy Roman Empire. He has to have a good deal of political capital, a good deal of authority, and gravitas with the other princes in order to get them all to, agree, have a diet, and all agree, and they're going to put all their forces in the field and do this or that. So all of Europe, the general notion of who you are is, Catholic is kind of a default. Nobody stops and thinks about it. I'm Catholic because there's really no alternative. There's Catholic, and then there's these heretics who will define themselves by whatever heresy, such as Cathars and whatnot. I'm from this town, in this city, like we mentioned, Italy, same thing in France, same thing in a lot of. I'm from this place, and oftentimes your dialect is going to show that. And then there's some notion that, well, I'm under this king and this lord, and this one's my king. And who the king was, if you're in these far-flung places, you wouldn't see pictures of him usually. You wouldn't know what he looked like. You would just know he was there and probably know his name because it would be proclaimed by somebody shortly after the coronation or what have you. Same thing with who's Pope. You wouldn't know who the heck the Pope was.
Yeah.
Until maybe after he was already dead and there's a new one.
Okay, so I'm Timothy of Flanders, living in Ghent, and I'm just a normal worker or whatever, guildsman or whatever I do in Ghent. So the only ruler that I even mostly deal with is the ruler of Ghent, and then I may deal with.
And secondarily would be the Lord of Burgundy, who technically has the feudal overlordship of Flanders in general.
Okay, so besides that, later on, Charles V, which we'll get into, becomes my greater ruler. But even then, I'm just not even really getting a deal. I mean, do I have to pay taxes to the emperor as a normal worker, or is that only
not very much? The taxes are going to be collected. There'll be like a levy, because the way taxes work in the Middle Ages is that tax breaks are permanent and tax increases are temporary. So, you have your normal system of taxation that goes through the feudal structure. You've got certain types of dues that basically the city council will charge. You see that in London, the city of London, Antwerp and places in the Netherlands. They have their tolls and their taxes, basically a pay-to-play type of thing. You got to, pay X amount and just to get in here, and then the city makes a certain amount of that. And that's the pool which the emperor will levy out of, or the king in England will levy out of if he needs to. And a lot of times these places have their charter rights, their feudal rights, and so you can't actually just go in and tax them. And so it has to be a special thing. So normally what the tax increase comes in, it's war, and it'll be voted in for a certain number of years, but only for a certain number of years, and then it will be taken away. So a similar thing in Spain, you have the Cortes, and so the essentially like a States General of sorts, National Assembly. It's parliamentary, and it's made up largely of the feudal lords and some members of the clergy. And that's what the parliament there is, and its importance fades largely as Spain itself fades from the map in the 1600s. But so this is what will eventually, they're the ones who decide that Charles, the son of Philip the Good, is going to be the next king after Ferdinand dies. And so that's how he becomes Carlos I of Spain, and eventually Charles V of the empire. And it combines all of these vast holdings with this dream of this worldwide empire. But anyway, so we're getting a little bit too ahead. So what's happening in the church, there's two things that are going on. So one, you now have the papacy is becoming ever more political, ever more stuck in the political conflicts in central Italy, and now living like temporal princes as well. So they're not merely there as the Pope, like we think of it today. He's also a temporal lord, and they have temporal politics that they want to play into various things. And so Boniface VIII comes, it kind of marks the waning of the papacy in the Middle Ages. And so he gets into some local squabbles with local families, and they go over to France and instigate the French king against him. We could go into that at a great length. But really what that comes down to then is Boniface VIII tries to use the tried and true method, the same thing Innocent III did just a century earlier, to control monarchs that won't obey the church. And it doesn't work. It completely fails. The King of France calls a bluff and says, well, you put me under interdict. I don't really care. Edward I in England, Longshakes, if you remember Braveheart. Not that that movie really bears any much historical value. And you have, he basically says, the King of France works out a deal with the Pope to tax the churches for raising, arms. And Edward's like, well, if he can do it, so can I. He can't raise money, and I can't, since we're going to be fighting each other. And so he starts taxing the church. And Boniface VIII tells him no. And Edward says, well, come and stop me. And the Pope put him under interdict. So now being put under an interdict, Edward is, just looking around, and that would have scared a king, especially 100 years earlier. And even a lesser king would still be nervous about it. Nobody can do any sacraments. You can't get married. You can't get buried. You think of, how much people are upset over the shenanigans they pulled back in March and are starting to pull again in time to shut everything down for Christmas, and how upset people are. Imagine that, in the entire country is shut down by order of the Pope, and everything's under interdict. Nobody can say, illicitly say mass, even burying the dead. You can't give them any special funerals or anything until after the interdict is lifted. So unless you have a dispensation or something like that. So this is a really terrifying thing. And Edward just looks at the priests and says, well, I'm here, nudge, nudge, man-at-arms, sword. And the Pope's way out there. So are you going to say mass or are you not? And they defy the interdict. The English church defies the interdict. And it proves that, the various tools that the papacy uses, once they become overused, they become despised. And so now the growing sense of it, because of the dynastic conflicts in France and England, but you'll see it in other places, there's kind of a notion beginning of being French, of being German, of being Spanish even, and that's forged out of the wars of the Reconquista in Spain, and that's creating that identity as a Spaniard, actually more so as a Castilian versus say a Catalonian versus say Portuguese or Basque. But those are all national identities that are now forming in the Spanish Peninsula. France, the crucible that really forms the notion of Frenchness, is actually the end of the 100 Years' War, where England has now conquered France, and now you have English France. And largely it was because of the disorganization of all these various disparate French, territories, towns, and cities. And Joan of Arc is actually the tool that brings together the notion of Frenchness, as opposed to the notion of being Catholic from this town that happens to also be in France. And so because that's in contradistinction to the English and Burgundians, and then primarily the English. So that, and that's what creates modern France and a unified front. So now, then you have Charles VIII, and Charles VIII says, well, this is going to be problematic. I got this notion of Frenchness and these expectations. He's famously ugly, but also famously wealthy, Charles VIII. And so he says, time to, before I have political dissension, let's have war abroad. So we're going to go make war in Italy. Get some of the riches in Italy, fill my coffers, get the bloodlust out before it comes into some kind of civil war, which eventually does fulminate in the next century with the wars of religion and such. But so that's kind of, the map where, being French and then also distinguishing yourself contrary to papal politics is important. And so where the papal politics don't seem to be going your way. So you have the Italian Wars. And during the Italian Wars, Louis XII manages to divorces his wife, ticks off Julius II. And so he switches the League of Cambrai from a war of Europe against Venice into a war of Europe against France. And then you get Henry VIII fighting under papal flags against a king because he divorced his wife and didn't listen to the Pope. Foreshadowing. And so on and so forth. But the notion is still, now these countries and your identities are starting to be crystallized by the time you get to the 16th century, just in time for the Reformation.
Right. Okay. So basically there's a great deal of subsidiarity your local lord is really what matters, but there's this growing rebellion by the most powerful rulers against the papacy, starting way back in the 1300s. And so what is the major shift that happens with the Protestant Reformation in this trend, both in Catholic and Protestant countries?
In the history of private life, as it were, and the lives of average people, like we said, that you know who your sovereign is, but unless you were somewhere near the royal city or places where you might have seen him, you've hardly ever seen your sovereign. You don't know what he looks like, right? You have two technologies that come along and change things. One is printing, and the other is the changes in art and in the development of new techniques and perspective and the increase, basically the Renaissance, which actually most people associate with Italy, but the real genuine rediscoveries as well as new developments in the Renaissance actually happen in Flanders, in Holland and in what we now call Holland and Belgium, those areas. And that's where you have like Jan van Eyck, for example. And his work was so impressive and so different that Giorgio Vasari, when he was writing his book on the history of the lives of artists, he actually claims that it's an assumption that he makes that Jan van Eyck had created oil painting. Now, that's actually not true. Oils have been around for a few hundred years, but it's Jan van Eyck that creates the way to use oil painting to create some of the amazing things you see, like the Ghent altarpiece, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And hopefully, if you're not familiar with it, Google up Ghent altarpiece, because it's absolutely amazing. And so this is early 1400s. It's incredible work. And so you have the printing as a painting anyway is now giving you lifelike things. And the effect that, say, the Ghent altarpiece has on people is that the dead seem to be walking. You have this Adam that's almost lifelike in paint. You have Christ seated on the throne, and even the details like the jewels on his clothing are incredibly clear. You could almost touch them and pull them out. It's how clear they are. And you have even in major theological distinctions in import that's being brought in too through the artwork. Printing comes along mid-century, and that's where so Gutenberg, right? The Gutenberg press. That's what really changes the game. Now, things like that have been worked on. Stories about it existing in China had spurred people on to try to invent the whole notion of movable type, that we can lay out a page and then move the type around and do a new page. And that's essentially what completely changes, revolutionizes culture. So most people cannot read throughout the Middle Ages because there's simply no reason to. The technology doesn't exist to provide a means, so contrary to the meta notion that we kind of get even in public school. Oh yeah, the medieval church, they didn't want people to read because then they could think for themselves and they wouldn't have to listen to the church. And they chained the Bibles in the churches so that you couldn't get them out. They chained the Bible in the church because if it was stolen, it was irreplaceable. And anyone who stole it, he could literally sell that for a small fortune because it was a monk in a monastery for 20 years that produced that Bible.
Right.
And that's also why most people don't read. The technology does not allow for a work to be created for mass consumption and read. I mean, if it's going to have any kind of, paper finally comes around in its durability around the 13th century. The paper is actually a medieval invention. Most people don't realize that either. You had papyrus in ancient times, in weaker forms of paper. The idea of, shaving down, trees into a paste and drying it, cutting it in this thick, durable paper. That's largely a medieval invention, the way it comes about. This previous that used vellum. Vellum is calf skin, and you have to, so once you've slaughtered a cow or a calf, you've got to literally, you get the pelt, and you've got about 100 man-hours working that pelt into something so simple as, vellum that can now be cut into sheets. And in all kinds of really, horrifying processes with a treat, because you didn't have industrial treatments for it. So you used urine, essentially. And so like in the monasteries, they would use the urine of the abbot, because he had the best diet. So therefore he had the best urine for tanning these hides into eventually, working them down into sheets of vellum. And then go for such even more horrifying processes like an act of parliament or something. But
oh, excellent.
Anyway, so that's so papers now come around, but even so, it's like most people could probably do numbers of some sort, make their mark. They could probably write, and anyone who's a merchant knew at least write and read enough that was useful for him for his business, doing accounting and what have you. But the average laborer, you could read measurements and follow plans and things like that. But a lot of them, there's simply no time let alone a means to produce something. Now the printing press changes that. So now, instead of 20 years to produce a Bible, it would be 6 months to a year to produce one. It would be a run. So, I mean, you get all the pages, and it works just like a wine press, and you can look these things up on YouTube. How did 16th century printing press work? And you just you crank this thing just like a wine press, and then, it comes down. And your type is an interesting detail. The type was in, it was a font, and you'd create your font, you'd sculpt it in a wooden block, and you'd create your mold off of that. And then you could create as many letters in that type of font, your source, your writing source, as you needed. And you had different styles. They became really classic very quick, which styles you were going to use, and so on and so forth. So the capital letters you kept in a box on the upper case, and your small letters you put on the lower case in your printer shop. And that's how those come down to those terms, uppercase and lowercase, because that's where you put the capital letters versus the small ones. So but anyway, so that production of books, now you can get a book. It's Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother, who brings printing into England and pays for that technology to be brought. And you have Caxton, who prints the very first book he prints is The Imitation of Christ in English. Margaret Beaufort has supplied the fourth book of a translation of it for the very first time you could get that in translation. And so now it spurs on a change. Now you can read and write if you just get the education in. So now the monasteries start opening up free schools. You see that in England. You also see it in the Netherlands and in Germany and in France and other places. And, teaching boys Latin, grammar, and rhetoric as part of the trivium. And if you succeeded very well in that, then, you have everything open to you. If you know Latin, everything's open. Right. And so this is kind of the change in private life, where now you have access to things. And engravers, you have Albrecht Dürer, for example. Albrecht Dürer is one who really pioneers a lot of the technology used to engrave images into books. They don't have to be hand done. You can actually end up making as many as you need pages of the book, because you have the, all the work of the engraver. Now you can replicate that image, right, in a woodcut. So that's actually essential for what comes next. So Luther comes around, and how to boil this all down to the succinct thing. So Luther is an Augustinian monk, and there's dubious stories about how we got there, and I won't go into too many of those right now because there's a lot of controversy surrounding some of that. But Luther is, increasingly drawn to this notion of salvation by faith alone. So in 1512 already, so we have his lecture notes from when he was teaching scripture at Erfurt in the Benedictine college there. And he's already at faith alone in his notes on Romans in 1512, 5 years before the Reformation itself begins. And so the occasion for it was actually rather this. So the Pope sends Tetzel into Germany, as German Dominican, to go preach indulgences. And Tetzel, when he gets to Wittenberg, sees that the Augustinians have the right of commissioning indulgences. So he takes that right away from the Augustinian monastery and transfers it to the Dominican monastery. And so this aggravates the Augustinians, because it's a major source of revenue for them. So Luther's superior goes to him and says, I want you to look into this whole question on indulgences. And then the 95 Thesis was the fruit of it. So what happens with the 95 Thesis then is that I recently gave a talk with this, and so imagine you have the time machine out of, say, Back to the Future, and Doc is explaining, it's like, don't ever set it to 2020. Instead, he says 1517, October 31st, 1517. I want to see that moment when Luther, hammers the nail that's heard around the world. And so you'll be sitting there, watch that cathedral, watch it. That's funny, nothing happened. Well, when's all this supposed to happen? You sit there for several hours and nothing happens. And then towards the close of the day, a clerk comes down from the university, and not with a nail and hammer, but with glue, puts up several notices, and among those is a public disputation in Latin with the 95 Theses that Luther is going to talk about. That's what happened on so-called Reformation Day. That's it.
That was epic.
Right. Super. It's kind of a letdown, because what actually happened was, in most of the 95 Theses, not all of it, but most of it actually is Catholic. And it's in Latin, because you would have scholastic disputations. People would come and watch all the doctors in their finery come out and argue in Latin, even though you only catch bits and pieces of what it even is. It was largely for the fun of it. It's like a public sport. Nice diversion from whatever else you have to do. And so some of Luther's students translated it into German and circulated it around. And that's several weeks later. That's what gets everything buzzing. That's what gets everybody interested in what's going on, because the subject of indulgences was becoming a big scandal. And the way that developed was simply that if you were a merchant or whatever, and the church says, hey, donate some money, and you'll get this indulgence, which is, theologically what it's actually doing is if you do a pious work, you're getting, the indulgentium is the value of, this added to the church's treasury. And so it's generally considered amongst theologians that having, that an indulgence like that will pay for your temporal punishment for sin, so that you won't have so long to suffer in purgatory, right? Not you're buying salvation, not that because, you're saved or you're not. It doesn't matter how many indulgences you got. If you're going to hell, you're going to hell, and that's not going to help you. So the idea of a pious work, you see this in the 15th century, you see this especially, like, say, with the Medici or moneylenders. And everyone knows they're Dante, the moneylenders. Well, they should know they're Dante, sorry. With the moneylenders, with bags of gold, cast out of the pit of hell, just doing this all the time. And, their hands are always moving, because in life they never work. So now they never did any work. So now in eternity, in hell, they're good. Their hands will always be moving to make up for that lack of work, right? And this is a terrifying image for a lot of moneylenders or Catholic. They're like, well, we have to kind of do some of this stuff. So how can we be saved? So the Medici take everything to a new level. So a lot of what they did is Giotto has a famous painting I can't remember exactly where it is. It's a chapel that Giotto did. It was paid for by a moneylender, and it shows the moneylender getting absolution and getting into heaven in one of the little corners of it, right? So the Medici, giving a pious work, pay for a hospital altar so that the people dying in the hospital can look upon this painting and be inspired for making their confessions before they die, or providing, this or that pious work or what have you. Well, the Medici go to the next level and say, well, why don't we just build you whole monasteries? So you have San Marco, which is built in Florence. And if you have not been and you get the chance to go, I don't know if we'll be able to travel under the COVID world order, but if you do get the chance, you visit San Marco. It's just one of the most amazing bits of painting, actually, because Fra Angelico paints this whole sequence of frescoes throughout the monastery. It's absolutely incredible. So it's all paid for by Cosimo de' Medici, Cosimo il Vecchio. He's a moneylender. He's very clever about all this. And so building this monastery, and he doesn't just do this, he's doing all sorts of pious works. So Pope Eugene IV gives him an indulgence so that he may go, it's basically giving him permission to go to confession. Because if you're going to go to confession and you're going to confess that, I committed usury. Are you going to do it again? Yes. Oh, I can't give you absolution. And Eugene IV basically says, well, now you can. And so as long as he's going to use it for a pious work, it's okay, which is really problematic in the theological tradition. And it'll probably take us too far afield to talk about that as opposed to usury. But it's the whole idea, and this is kind of the creation of capitalism, in the sense of, let's say, a modern sense of that word, of the idea of where, you make investments and we're trying to increase our self-profit. And by doing so, we'll benefit other people. And it doesn't really matter if we flout this rule and that that law, and if all in the end it all comes out well, we're going to do this business and make the money without looking at so much the consequences. As long as in the end everyone makes money, we're okay. And that kind of spirit, and that's really what it is. It's the spirit of capital. It's the spirit of me as the individual working and trading and doing this stuff, not me as a member of the community doing this, that, and the other thing. And by community, I do not mean communism, but. Because, you could look at almost anything and call it capitalism if you see people laboring and producing things. And because, capital is the stuff you take and you produce it into wealth. And that wealth then benefits you because you can sell it or you can use it or whatever it happens to be. So this is kind of the philosophy and the idea that's coming about with the Medici. You can really look at it here, even more so than the Jews or anyone else people historically want to put, the formation of capitalism on. And so that adds to kind of an individualist spirit that permeates, especially in Florence. And Florence is a republic. It's not it's not a monarchy. And there's a number of republics in Italy that are independent of the papal state or any other monarchy that happens to be in Italy. Like, so for example, in Naples, which is run by the Spanish. So this idea you also see in the Netherlands. The Netherlands are a commercial, mercantile area, the Low Countries or Flanders, and they subside on mercantile activity, going up and down all the rivers and the artificial rivers they've created through the dike and levee system and whatnot. So this is what men look to in a community, and so the only thing that to change the nature of that community is to change the religion, and that's all that it would take to basically get you toward this secular community. So anyway, so all these things are kind of in play. And in growing, the life of average people isn't changing, but there's one detail. So as Luther becomes more and more famous, his portrait can be seen in books and in pamphlets and things like that. So Luther is better known by his likeness by average people than any monarch, any emperor in history, right? Except where they've had statues in multiple corners and things like that. The likeness of Luther is better known than any monarch or any royalty or any pope at that time. And that's because the revolutionary elements of printing, of art, and of woodcuts. And that's a really amazing thing that has a cultural shift, because you can look at all the intellectual movements and how they affect things, and they do affect things, especially in the Renaissance, which I haven't really talked about yet. I meant to get into that more, but Renaissance humanism, which is not anti-Catholic. It's not like your secular humanism of today, but it's looking at the human arts and the kind of the glorification of how God has ennobled man and what man can accomplish with God's things. So let's look back to the people who even did it without the power of the church. Now, some humanists are a little further than that, but that's essentially kind of the very notion of humanism, right? So, but that's a philosophical movement among the elite for the most part. For average people, the idea that we can read a book, we can go buy this book, and seeing Luther's portrait in many places, this is kind of fuels the ideas of the Reformation, of getting away from that political power and control of the popes, even a certain extent of emperors, and that leads you to the Peasants' Rebellion, in 1525.
So it sounds like what you're getting at here, in particular, is the creation of the media a little bit here, with the with just a face and the psychological influence that can have on the masses,
right.
And
which will give way to state-run media, as we see in the Elizabethan context.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, so we were going to try to focus on 4 countries in our time period here, and we've got so much to cover. It's hard to know where to begin here, but I mean, we've got two Catholic countries, 2 Protestant countries. You've got Spain and France, both Catholic, at least in name. And then you have the Dutch, the Netherlands, who have a Protestant rebellion, a political revolution, and also the English, of course. So how does the rise of the secular state with these changes, how is it the same and different between these different countries in this time period?
What becomes the same is that everyone's trying to ape Henry VIII and his achievement. So we backtrack. So Henry VIII, he's raised very pious, and he comes to the throne as a warrior king. He wants to emulate Henry V, restart the 100 Years' War with France, and he goes to war with France under papal flags, obviously during the Italian Wars, and he expects to to win these great victories, but his money runs out. He just doesn't have enough money, doesn't have enough men, and the French get organized under the new king, Francois I, the Count of Angoulême. So now you have this, now Henry has to back out, come back in with peace conferences, things like that. And he's looking for ways to be important. And then the marital disputes come in, and largely that's brought on, how do we put it? Henry was he was already having mistresses and stuff, but the idea of breaking with his wife, of getting an annulment and getting a new wife, because we're not talking about divorce the way we mean that in a modern sense, because nobody was divorced in England until about the 1690s, legally speaking, divorced in that notion. So what he was getting was an annulment, and he wanted, early on too, he was thinking about it, but what spurred it on was in 1525. So or a little bit before that, but Charles V has a problem in 1523. So he's ticked off the Spanish whom he's the king of, and he's running everything from Europe, and he's asking for more Spanish money and troops coming in from the Americas to go fight the French, basically, in the continent. So he needs all these things, and then the Spanish decided, there's a good portion of the Spanish that decide to revolt, and they put his mother Juana as a figurehead until they can find a new king, and so it's called the Comuneros. I guess it comes out to brotherhood or something of that sort, the brothers, but they are, fighting, against Charles to free Spain from his rule. So Charles, has no way to get there because he has to cross the Pyrenees, and that means dealing with major French armies in order to get across back into Spain. So he goes to England, hat in hand, to visit Henry VIII. He wants money, he wants ships, and in other things. And in exchange, he's going to pay all this money. In fact, loans that are outstanding from back when Ferdinand still hadn't paid all of Catherine's dowry. He's going to pay, all these things. He's going to make Wolsey the Pope. He's going to make increase Henry's influence throughout, Europe. He'll make sure Henry gets a big piece of France, and so he promises everything. He even gets betrothed to Henry's daughter, to Mary Tudor. So, Henry is like, wow, this is going to be great. And now Catherine takes on a good deal of importance because it's the dynastic, logic of that marriage was that now, Henry's still in his prime, in his 30s. Catherine is 40, 41, frumpy, perpetually pregnant and miscarrying, and so out of shape. Still eminently respectable, but not sexually desirable, especially for Henry. So then the whole thing falls apart. Henry, shows up in 1523, shows up again in France in 1524 with an army. Charles never materializes. 1525, he decides he's going to sit it out. Then you have the Battle of Pavia, and Charles V takes Francois I prisoner, the King of France. So now Henry hears this, and he's like, oh, and he didn't have an army in the field. So he scrambles to get troops together, and it fails. And he needs to go to Parliament. Parliament's not willing to offer new taxes when they've already been way overtaxed, the people in wars in 1523 and 1524. So Wolsey comes up with this great idea. Well, let's do a forced loan. But nobody likes that word, so we'll call it the amicable grant.
Propaganda.
Right, as spin doctor in chief. And Wolsey was very much the spin doctor in chief whenever he needed to be. So, but this, so not only the nobility are grumbling and revolting and saying, no, we're not going to do it, but there's even revolts in the counties because the people know that their lords are going to tax them for it to help make up the income. And so Henry has to abandon the idea. So he writes to Charles V saying, hey, it's God's will that you have so conquered the French king. Why don't we partition France and between us? And then Charles V calls his bluff and says, well, if you want your part of France, you got to take it, and he knows Henry can't take it. He knows Henry doesn't have the money. And part of this is because Charles doesn't want an equally powerful rival to replace the one he just captured. So in the end, Henry can't pull it together. And then Charles, on top of that, jilts Mary, completely breaks the betrothal, and marries somebody else. And so now Henry is completely humiliated. Catherine's even more humiliated. And now it comes back to that question: what in the world was the logical sense of that dynastic marriage? None. See, if it had succeeded for Henry, he had become wealthy and famous. The fact that he didn't have a son wouldn't be the end of the world, because she was very popular. And he was, no subject could be too mighty at this point to challenge him. So that, so having Mary, people always try to say, oh yeah, without a son, the whole kingdom would have fallen apart. It's nonsense. She would have been entirely fine to rule as a queen regnant. Right? Isabella had done it, and people knew that she was famous, and so that it was an idea that had its time now in England. It could work, as we see 20 years later, or 30 years later or so. So what happens then is Henry is not famous beyond his dreams. He is not, the war king that has reconquered France. And, in Catherine's family just gave him the finger. So, after he did all these things for them. So now he's like, that's it. And he starts looking around, not just for mistresses, but for marriage. So he starts the work, the annulment proceedings, even before he's noticed Anne Boleyn. So if it wasn't Anne, it would have been somebody else. But Anne Boleyn shows up at court, and she's a real dynamo. For whatever reason, she was said to have some kind of deformity with one of her fingers. But that just, once Henry noticed, that actually made him even more attracted. But she knew how to play a certain card with Henry. First, she wasn't going to give in and become a mistress, because she was raised practically in the French court with her, her father's an English, ambassador, envoy there. And she had seen the mistresses get used and flattered and then discarded. And she didn't want to go that route. So she, so when Henry's, private, men come and say, hey, the king would like you to be his consort, however you want to dignify the relationship. She says no. And in this, it's the only thing you could possibly tell Henry no for. And that drives him crazy. And that's what begins the whole process. And so Henry, then, so the English church is not particularly corrupt. It's certainly not more so than anywhere else in the continent. In fact, it's actually producing a lot of great works, great theology, great churchmen. You have St. John Fisher, obviously, John Colet. You have Tunstall, Cuthbert Tunstall, and others that are, you have monasteries are still, filling up. There's no problem in vocations. There's not a real strong desire for change in the English church, except in, for bishops to actually reside in their diocese. There's the noted usual things that are problematic in that time. And Lutheranism, has a slight appeal, but largely with the groups, descending from White Wycliffe, and so the Lollards, right? So they are, they're attracted to the Lutheran ideas that are starting to filter in. Henry has a hatred of Lutheranism. And this is actually a thing that causes problems for, say, Thomas Cromwell later, as he tries to ally Henry to Lutheranism. Henry hates Lutheranism. And so he writes his famous book on the Seven Sacraments against Luther. Luther writes his reply where he calls Henry every name in the book. And that even more enrages Henry against Lutheranism. We can't have that. So even when he breaks from the church, Lutheranism is out the window. Cranmer and Cromwell, they work on him at different points. They try to get Henry convinced to get rid of the mass and replace it with a communion service. And then Henry's like, yeah. Oh, but that sounds like that bastard Luther, and I can't have anything to do with that. So he can't. And that's largely how it would go. So anyway, Henry pursues the route to get an annulment, and he looks at it that I've done these great services to the church. I should get this. In the last century, Alexander VI annulled Louis XII for far less reasons than what Henry was bringing to the fore now. And so it seemed like it should just go very smoothly, and it didn't. And there's different politics. Actually, the only one who really saw in Henry's circle that really saw the politics for what it was actually Anne Boleyn. She was the one who actually correctly judged the mood in Rome, the dynastic politics with Charles V being so strong. And she says, well, yeah, I don't think this is going to work. And so eventually, you have the papal inquest and so many things. Yeah, John Fisher completely tank the papal inquest when they might have done something in Henry's favor by coming out and telling, going through the books that he's been writing, defending Henry's marriage to Catherine. And he declares that he's ready to lay himself down like a new John the Baptist in defense of that marriage. And, of course, Henry, through Stephen Gardner, actually, they completely say, oh, he's being ridiculous. He's being completely over the top. And I mean, to compare the king to Herod. And it's like, now, a couple years later, did they remember that Herod had chopped off the head of John the Baptist when they chop off John Fisher's, So anyway, so that all falls apart. So Henry says, okay, I need something else. And Anne Boleyn introduces Cranmer. Cranmer was the family chaplain for the Boleyns. He was an otherwise obscure Cambridge don. He was part of a group at Cambridge called Little Germany, which included Stephen Gardner and several others, another fellow named Barnes, who caused some mischief later. And so they had basically, he was already brought to Lutheran ideas, but he's a Catholic priest, technically, at least as far as he's in England. And in those days, what you did is you called it reform opinion, because that word Protestantism hadn't really set in yet. And it won't, because the original use of that term had absolutely nothing to do with religion. And it was a bunch of Catholic and Protestant lords protesting Charles V centralizing policies, and they made Luther kind of their centerpiece. Like, well, we're going to defend him as kind of like a bargaining piece to fight against Charles V centralizing tendencies, and that was necessary for Charles V because he needs their help if the Turks would invade, and indeed the Turks did in Vienna in 1529. They almost took the city, and there's I'll start going into military history, and we'll get so sidetracked it's not even funny. So we'll leave that. So Anne Boleyn's of Reformed opinion, so she introduces Cranmer, who's very much the same. Cranmer comes in to Henry and says, psst, do you see popes in the Bible? I don't see popes in the Bible. See, you're going about this all wrong. We have kings in the Bible and we have bishops in the Bible, but I don't see any popes. And so Henry's like, well, that's really interesting. See, you're going about it all wrong. You want the Pope to rule. What if it's not a question of whether the Pope can or can't dispense? What if it's really a question of the Pope is just a bishop in Rome and you are the head of the church in England? And Henry's like, oh, wow. that's a really interesting thought. So then he begins the the mechanisms through Parliament. So this Parliament, actually, Thomas More, as Lord High Chancellor, opened up this Parliament. Now it's called historians call it the Reformation Parliament, because it would sit continuously until 1539. It would produce all of the legislation. So Henry didn't just break from Rome. He didn't just say, all right, that's it, new church, and you marry me, we're all good. What he does is he actually very cleverly crafts civil and state regulation to change that church and state relationship. And that's the way it works. So first, what he does is, they goes after the clergy. The clergy, now that Wolsey, because after Wolsey can't get the divorce, the annulment for Henry, he falls from power. Henry gets a treason trial set up for him, and he dies before it can all take place. And so Thomas More becomes the Lord High Chancellor, and Bishop Warham, again, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, he begins finally to take up his role now that he's not worried about Wolsey. And so the thing that happens is that while they're in convocation, Henry decides to invoke this very obscure law, praemunere, which is a law forbidding appeals to the papacy as a foreign power, as it is a foreign power outside of England. And it actually comes back from Edward I in that earlier conflict we mentioned. And he threatens them, well, you guys are all guilty of praemunere by accepting Wolsey's legatine authority, omitting the fact that Henry forced that on them. That's immaterial. Facts don't matter. You're asserting that without evidence, right? So the clergy get scared, and and Fisher is trying to rally the fight, but they're really looking for Archbishop Warham, because he's the Archbishop of Canterbury, and and he's just kind of terrified. He's old, and now this all comes upon him in his old age, and he doesn't want to deal with it. So Fisher comes up with, what if we just said, as far as the law of Christ allows, we will give him this title, head of the Church of England. And Warham, kind of wakes up from his slumber. He's like, oh, that would do it, and I'd save my head. That'd be great. And so that's essentially what they do. And Henry first is mad about it. He's like, well, it's better than nothing. And so that, the clergy entirely capitulated. And then he sees, okay, this is going to be an easy game. They're all too scared of their comfortable livings to fight as we do this. So he starts producing this legislation through the Commons, and which would reform these things in canon law, reform how monasteries their incomes are brought about and disseminated, things in church law that really the state has no business encroaching upon. Fisher actually comes out and speaks against it in the House of Lords. According to the early biographer, he says, my lords, I don't know if you've noticed, but this is a very attack on the church herself. And if it's allowed to continue, you'll see the church herself go the way of places like in Germany and Bohemia and other places where the Lutherans now hold sway. And so the Lords reject it, so they have to come back and refine all the legislation. And that's what they do, is there's weeks and weeks of work that goes in, all really subtle things changing. And then so Henry basically prepares legislatively that break with Rome, and he just holds on to see what Rome is going to do. Because he knows the Pope knows he's preparing this break. So what's the Pope going to do? At some point, they established better relations, and so Henry takes advantage of that to get Cranmer appointed as the new Archbishop of Canterbury when Warham dies. And so now everything's in place. And the Pope finally, delays too long, and finally Henry says, well, that's it. So he, in his very subtle way of doing it, because he doesn't declare anything yet, instead what he does is he puts out the, first he gets married to Anne Boleyn. He has Cranmer declare the marriage between him and Catherine invalid, and the marriage between him and Anne valid. So it's kind of like that line that Simpsons take on this, right? Where the Reverend Lovejoy be Cranmer, and he says, by the power invested in me, by you, looking at Henry, because that's essentially how it worked. Henry basically said, yep, we're just going to do it. And they steamroll through and they create the Act of Succession. Everyone must swear that the issue, those who will succeed the throne, are Henry and Anne's issue, not that of Catherine's. And there's even a preamble where you had to swear that the marriage between Henry and Catherine was invalid, and the marriage between Henry and Anne is valid. So it's a little bit of legislation. You have to swear basically that the Pope has no authority in England. That's what you're saying. And that's why Fisher and More would not swear to it, because it was that subtle thing. The Act of Succession they were willing to swear to, because you can make up who the king and the parliament can ratify who's going to succeed. But as soon as you get to that preamble, you're basically denying papal authority. And then they have the further legislation down the road, the Act of Royal Supremacy. And this is where the real game changer in terms of legislation, those relationships with church and state. Henry creates a theocracy by this document, where he says that the king is the absolute head of the Ecclesia Anglicana on earth, of the English church on earth. And so he's not only the Lord of men's bodies, but also of their souls, right? And so it really is a theocracy. State and church are so intertwined that, if you went to confession because you ate meat on a Friday, for example, you got a penance. But now, if you were seen to, under the new system, and this will be the same under Elizabeth, if you're seen to eat meat on Friday, you'll go to the stocks. You have a public penance enacted by the state that's going to take over. So this situation creates a lot of wealth and power for Henry, because now all the wealth of the church is at his disposal. You have so obviously it doesn't work with Henry and Anne. Anne doesn't make the transition from royal mistress to queen very well. She's put to death. He marries Jane Seymour the next day, because Henry is always very good about lining up the next wife as he gets rid of the first one. So he marries Jane Seymour the next day. Actually, the only break in that would be Jane Seymour. She dies in childbirth, so she doesn't. And she's always remembered as the good wife because she gave Henry his son, right? But so even later portraits, when he's married to Catherine Howard or Catherine Parr, he's always painted with Jane Seymour because she's the good wife. She gave him the son. So nevertheless, what happens when she dies, when Jane Seymour dies, is that Henry's first wife, actually when he's married Jane Seymour even, his first wife died of natural causes, although no doubt brought on by the horrible treatment Henry gave her. His non-wife was dead, at least, apparently, ostensibly for treason, even though all historians pretty much agree those are trumped up charges. And now he's married to Jane, who's a Catholic. Technically, Henry could have rejoined the church right now in 1535 when he, or is it 36? I forget which year he marries Jane Seymour. I think it's 36. He marries Jane Seymour. Right then, he could have rejoined the church. And even Pope Paul III tried to send some envoys to suggest that idea to Henry. But it wasn't going to happen, because Henry found out how powerful he is now and being in command of the church. So even though he could have, he had absolutely no desire to. Why go back to being subject to the Pope, as it were? And that's kind of the spark of the secularist nationalism. The kings of France, who generally were considered to be one of the more absolutist in terms of their rule of government, they see this. Francois I, Henry's rival, he sees this. And all the things that he had managed to gain from the popes over the years and his predecessor, in terms of the right over taxing churches, tithes, and things like that he could make use of in the royal treasury, even that seemed to fail in comparison to Henry in terms of what he had accomplished. In the end, Francois does end up stay Catholic. And there's a few influences on him. And then likewise, his son, Henri II, is thinking several times to do like Henry VIII. And again, it's actually the Cardinal Duke of Lorraine, Charles de Guise, who actually helps keep Henri II in the Catholic Church and not go the way that Henry does. So the French notion, too, so they see Henry, well, we can't have, bloody Angleterre be better than we are. So, so that's why those notions of that state, power over the church come in. But France is about to undergo a massive civil war that will totally change its entire constitution, really. So we'll get to that in a minute. But so Henry's, establishes that model. It's, Edward is going to push it a little further, and he dies. Mary goes back to Catholicism. She dies. And now you're at Elizabeth. And Elizabeth resurrects the act of royal supremacy. Elizabeth creates the state as this notion of the state, because, of course, it's a minority Protestant state in a majority Catholic country. By the end of her reign, it's a majority Protestant country in a minority Catholic country. And they didn't do that by, just outright killing everybody that they could. Right? They did that by a slow, subtle process of state propaganda, the media, essentially. And the English state was in control of all the pulpits. They're in control of all the means of information, books, heavy censorship, what doesn't come in the country, and so on and so forth. You are fined if you don't go to the established Protestant church. You are, you got to go, whether you're a low church Protestant that doesn't like the Anglican church, or you're a Catholic. Either way, you're going to be fine. You're a recusant, recusare, you refuse. So recusant Catholics. And already of the act in the 1550s, 1560s, Jesuits, etc., which essentially makes it illegal to be a Catholic priest in England. And we are 20 or more years before the Spanish Armada. This is not a reaction of fear that the Spanish are going to invade. This is not out of, it's simply the Pope's the Antichrist. So everyone there is the part of the Antichrist meant to overturn our realm. So therefore, all priests, it's automatic penalty of death. There was even one case of a priest that was on a ship and traveling, in disguise, and the ship it shipwrecked on England, and some of the priest stuff started washing up from the cargo holds, and they knew a priest was on board, and they caught him, and they questioned him. He's like, well, I had no intention of going here. I was going to Spain. I wasn't going to stop in England at all. And they ended up executing him anyway. Because he managed to happen to be in England.
But what's interesting here is that, so you're saying that English really is the English state is really the one that truly succeeds in massive propaganda for the sake of state power.
Had Henry VIII died in 1526 or so, he would have been remembered as Pope who tried to make England great again in the continental affairs of Europe, like Henry V or something, failed, and that would have been it. And who knows where things would have gone ultimately. I mean, but it would have been a very different thing. So, and Henry's good with the signs of monarchy, the symbols, the propaganda, even the music. He even after he breaks from Rome, he doesn't want the Bible in English. It still has to be in Latin. And that's old legislation that comes down from John Wycliffe days. And that's why the church in England had a stronger reaction against it than, say, in Europe itself, where they had Bibles in French, and they had them in Spanish, and they had them in German, even before Luther. So it was, or at least parts of them anyway. So Anne Boleyn sets up a Tyndale Bible from William Tyndale in her bedchamber. And of course, the bedchamber is not a private place. It was actually a public place, believe it or not. Because it's not actually the bed. It's like, a reception area, like a parlor of sorts. And that's where even, royal business would happen. Same thing with the king's bedchamber. And so the terms belie a different reality back then than what comes to our mind today. And so she sets up a Tyndale vernacular Bible, which is illegal. Normally you get put to death for that. So it's kind of puts the challenge to Henry to embark on more reformed opinion. And so Henry takes it up. And so he has a Bible, getting some of the more objectionable things in Tyndale that he didn't like out of it. And he has it prepared, and he calls it the first authorized edition of the Bible. So it's authorized by the king himself. And there's a woodcut in there. You can look it up. The first authorized Bible frontispiece, I think, should get you the search. And you have this massive, larger-than-life Henry VIII in the middle, teeny little Christ up at the top. And Henry, like a new Moses, he has a sword in one hand and the Bible in the other. He's giving the Bible to the people. And in the background, on the one side, you have Catholics who are put in jail, and low church rebellious Protestants who won't accept the king's religion, are being hanged. And so to give you an idea, so that's what's on the frontispiece of this Bible. Henry as the new Moses and the lawgiver, the anointed by Christ. We're at divine right of kings. Now, it's a new concept. A lot of people think every king in the Middle Ages is divine right of kings. Not at all. This is a new concept, and Henry pioneers it. Right. And Elizabeth rules with it too, but she's also smart and astute politically to rule only within a certain level. So the idea is still divine right, but the way they go about it is a little more circumscribed than later English monarchs will do. And so that's what, so for Elizabeth, you have this crafting of state propaganda, even the worship of the state in a certain way, because of course the religious church of the state is also run by the monarch. And so the ideas of religion and worship, they become, very, very similar in that notion of this theocracy that's been then crafted. And so Elizabeth has portraits done of herself, and you can see these; they're still around. It's the most notable example is the rainbow portrait, and where she's dressed in a certain regalia, and there's a little line. Nulla idris sine sole. There's no rainbow without the sun. She's the sun. But interestingly, let you think back to the sun god, Ra, ancient Egypt, and things of this sort. And then what she got covered all over her garment, kind of etched in the silk, almost like threading in the silk, their eyes and ears. I see everything, I hear everything. And sure enough, They've got spies in every corner because they're deadly scared of the Catholic North. So they have spies, criminals or whatever, represents, hey, turn on your friends and we'll pay you and we won't kill you. And so, and you have the English archives are full of writings, little scribbles, whatever, from spies all around, going around to get back to the crown. Sir Francis Walsingham creates basically the equivalent of MI6, if you will. And in terms of a massive spy network that's not only functioning in England, it's also functioning with English interest in the Netherlands too. Wherever there's English assets, they're also spying on their own assets to make sure they're keeping the right way. This is what happens to Christopher Marlowe, the playwright. He's supposed to be a state asset in the Netherlands, and he switches to the Catholic side. So Richard Poley was part of the Shakespeare Company actually at first. Who's also a paid English agent. He actually is part of he goes and he grabs Marlowe, brings him back to England. That's where the famous incident where they kill him at the mattress. And there's all the various conspiracy theories about what actually went down there, some of which are more valid than others, actually. It's one of those other lacuna in history. What really happened to Marlowe? Something screwy went on there. But anyway, so Elizabethan England was a police state with strict state control of the media. You could not say what the media determined was, the media determined what was true. It is determined Catholicism is not true, that it's actually brutish and, the servant of Antichrist and therefore evil. And you can't escape that, right? And so I gave a talk on laying out these facets of the Elizabethan program. And then I said, now imagine, let's fast forward to today. You put something in on Google and you get only the results they have determined. They have algorithms that control what results you get. So first I gave something stupid. I said, oh, wait, let's take the moon landing. And I really don't care about the moon landing conspiracy theory. I mean, it's one of these things that these days, nothing would surprise me. If we did find out it was all fake and staged for patriotic stuff, I wouldn't be in the slightest bit surprised. But on the other hand, that's not a theory that I particularly ascribe to or going to hitch my wagon to unless somebody's got the proof. So, but let's take that anyway, just for the sake of argument. And you look up moon landing. Well, you can't find even the people claiming in their arguments claiming for why it didn't happen. You can't even find Buzz Aldrin. It was him or it was Neil Armstrong. It was one of those two. One of these guys was asking questions, trying to get them to admit that it was fake. And it gives them a left hook. You can't find that video. It's all scrubbed. All you can find is why it's not so, it's not so, it's not so. Think about the election, evidence of electoral fraud. All you get is there is none, there is none, there is none, there is none. And it may be true for all I know, but, I have a hard time seeing there wasn't any, right? They've decided what will and won't be true. You can't look at the information on one side and the other and make a decision about it because they've already decided what is and isn't true, right? So, and this is exactly what's going on in Elizabethan England, is that Catholic books, that's propaganda, that's evil. You can't have that, right, at all. So the French create very much, they very much want to ape this system. Pardon me. The one thing that's inhibiting them is the war on their own doorstep. So you have Calvinism that's been growing in France. There's no real incentive for the monarchy. There is a bit of incentive for the monarchy, but it's not, the risks are greater because they know the discontent in the country over Calvinism. The larger Catholic majority populace doesn't like it. So they have to play it a little more carefully. And the thing is, they're already getting so much money from the church because of various concessions that were given to them over the centuries by popes. There's really no super incentive for the French kings, like, say, in England with the suppression of the monasteries, or in Germany with the same thing, and grabbing church land and church property. Well, you're not going to you're not going to be able to do that so much because the people won't allow it. So, and they already have so much of it. Well, do we have to? And then it is, well, what do we do with the Calvinists, though? And so the French are really nervous about the Council of Trent. And they really are. There's only one cardinal that's really pushing to get into Trent and really be part of that whole council, and that's, again, Charles, the Duke of Guise. And eventually he does, and he actually majorly contributing to the third period of Trent. So the French are actually, instead, the government's trying to stop Trent from happening, and do a few other things that really interfere with how Trent works, for a number of years. And they won't let their bishops go to Trent. And so it's largely just the Italians and the Spanish and some of the Germans that are at Trent for a good long time. The French crown thinks it can deal with it itself. And they're involved in wars with the empire, with the English. Sometimes they're allied with the English. Just depends what's going on. And that's, of course, the pattern of the first period of the century, where you have Francois I, Charles V, and Henry VIII constantly stabbing each other in the back, and it's kind of ring around the rosary who's going to get the other one first. They keep switching their alliances. They fight the other ones, and it's so the situation kind of continues. France is now moving into this period where you have, Calvinists going after Catholic villages and killing priests and whatnot. Then you have Catholic reprisals that go to a Calvinist village and kill the mistress and kill the, just burn down the church or whatever. And things are really getting out of hand. And in the midst of that, you have the St. Bartholomew's Massacre, more famously because the Admiral Coligny, who was Protestant, and they thought, oh, if we just kill him, it'll all go away. And then it becomes kind of this, hey, we're going to kill the Protestants now, and the discontent with Catholics over the Calvinist situation just boils over, and they all start, assaulting each other. So the idea is we're going to keep France Catholic, and then you have the monarch Henri III is really nervous about this after this Henri II. He decides that he wants to ally himself with the Protestant party because he's really nervous about the Catholic side. So you have this whole league, the Catholic League, which is even favoring bringing in the Spanish to help put down the Calvinists. And that's what really makes Henri III nervous. And the Guise, one of the major Catholic families, they're in favor of it. And this is all super complicated, so I'm trying to get it to the simplest thing. Henri III gets killed, actually. And he's assassinated. And so he, in the midst when he's dealing with Henri Bourbon. And so now Henri Bourbon is the chief of the Protestant party. He's the next in line for the throne. And so now you have a Protestant who's going to inherit the throne in France. So the whole country is now in an armed camp. Your notion of France, it's largely Catholic versus Protestant. And that's how, the people are seeing it. So whether we have to go to the Spanish in order to say, hey, we should get Philip II's daughter, the Infanta, because she's actually the legitimate daughter between Philip II and Elizabeth Valois. So she's actually descended. But then they have to get rid of Salic law. You can't inherit through the female. And that's the big rub amongst the political factions. So all of France is in this big civil war, and eventually it does get resolved, because it will go on forever if I try to even enter in the slightest details of all this. Henri Bourbon converts to Catholicism. He pulls the rug out of from under the Catholic League, and he says the famous phrase, Paris is worth the mass. And so he converts and he becomes actually a fairly decent king when he gets into it. He gets assassinated by this crazy ex-Dominican named Ravaillac. And I can't remember what his motives were, what even that was all about. But, so the monarchy then crafts itself because they're worried about that. There's more civil wars in the next century, the Fronde. So France positions itself into this. The king is the center notion of what it is to be French. The Council of Trent publishes stuff, and they're like, yeah, but we're not going to implement most of that. And they don't, actually. It's not even until after the French Revolution that a good amount of Tridentine legislation finally gets enacted in France. So it's a really nutty situation. Even quo primum. All right. Well, there's trads running around saying quo primum is infallible. Well, the French certainly didn't think so. And no pope ever declared them to be heretics or in schism because they didn't implement it. So you could still do the Parisian Rite and all these other things that technically should have been suppressed by quo primum. They keep doing them.
Now, question for you. Now, you mentioned before that the propaganda, it sounds like one of the biggest tools you said about England was the media. Mm-hmm. Is that one of the biggest tools both in England and elsewhere with these grabbing of state power, kind of a psychological tool, basically? Is that one of the big tools they use? It's one of the big tools. So in France, for example, French culture, French ideas, there's like a notion of Frenchness that develops out of all the complicated wars of religion. And again, with the Fronde that happens while Louis XIV is in his infancy. And so the state then, after he comes to his majority and the War of the Fronde is ended, it's like this sort of civil war. It's largely limited to the aristocracy, as opposed, say, to the English. They start crafting a state propaganda that's based around various symbols of the king. So he's the Roi du Soleil, the Sun King, Louis XIV. And even the nobles, they got to restrict their movement, so they're expected to come spend time at court. It's going to be so expensive, they're going to be too broke to raise an army against him. Right? It's the idea, essentially. The notions of Frenchness, of the king, of his signs and symbols, his iconography, these are all presented around the kingdom in a number of different ways. There's still strong censorship. So the church still has a presence in France, but a lot of its work is being circumscribed by the monarchy. And so now, even though it's a Catholic country, they're going to war in different parts of Europe. The Pope's telling them no.
And Louis XIV says, "Oh no, eh? Well, what if I go all Henry VIII on you?" And oh no, 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 no. Oh, we didn't say anything. The Pope say they could have backed down. And that it's a big problematic thing for the later 17th century. So the propaganda is really strong in terms of creating the cult of personality of the monarch, even in a certain sense, the cult of the monarch, even though there's no formal worship of him. God, Louis XIV certainly had that idea of him in his own mind. If you look at various paintings that he makes where he's practically like a god, all done in classical style and things like that. And so, these are spread around so people can see them.
Okay, so you have these monarchs. You have Elizabeth. You've got Francois, Henri, various Henris, using the propaganda to create the cult of the king. Now, over in the Netherlands, you have a Republican revolution happening.
Right. At first, it's not quite Republican, but anyway, but it is somewhat still. It's more oligarchical in the persons of the House of Orange, but. So what happens in Holland? So for the background, so the Netherlands, what today we call Belgium in Holland, these countries were just collectively Flanders and the Low Countries, and they were, under their own, governorship until Philip the Good inherits the Netherlands. And I can't remember the exact process where that happens. So he's the Lord of Burgundy. Burgundy's already a fairly wealthy section of France, and so that takes over. They take over the Netherlands, and they look at how things are working there and how the mercantile trade is extremely wealthy and profitable. And Philip the Good realizes, well, the very smartest thing I could do is leave the place alone and just take a few tolls out of it, because that'll be way more than if I try to impose too many taxes on here. Kind of like your low tax, high output, and it made sense. So then Charles V is essentially the Lord of the Netherlands, and he puts his sister Mary as the regent there until Philip, gains majority. Philip becomes the King of Spain. So eventually, after Charles V dies in 1558. So what he does is he divides up his dominions, and so Ferdinand I, his nephew, becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. His son Philip becomes Philip II of Spain. And also he gains the Netherlands. So he's also the king of the Netherlands as well. And so the whole region's under Spain. And at first it seems to go pretty well, but then you have, the problem, the growing, movement of Calvinists in Spain. So the Spanish go to put it down. So representatives from the Low Countries come down to Philip, and eventually they end up getting put to death, which really ticks people off back in Holland. So the Spanish come in and impose things that worked very well in Spain, which is not a mercantile country, even though it is possibly one of the richest and the greatest countries in Europe at the time. And it's generally seen that the Spanish are going to have this worldwide empire. It's actually rather hollow. And there's one economic historian, Rodney Stark, and actually he has probably what I think is the best theory altogether, the best explanation of Spain. Why is Spain like on the cusp of world empire in the 1500s, and by the end of the 1600s, going into the 18th century, it's the sick man of Europe. They're so poor, they're so meaningless, except for their very large fleets. So how did all that happen? What's really that Spain never became a modern economy. They never became a place with large amounts of production and industry and so many things going on. It remained largely feudal and agrarian. So the result being, even when the Armada came, to go to England, they had to buy a map in the Low Countries because they had no means they had no cartography in Spain that could produce this map, right? And so you have things of this sort that really kind of weigh it down. So it's got all the money, but it's gradually flowing out. To the Spanish look at the problem in the Netherlands, and they start to impose Spanish taxation, and they start to impose other things, even the Inquisition, things that worked well enough in Spain, but were out of character for the local people in the Netherlands. So that even Catholics are not necessarily too eager to support the Spanish. So anyway, so the 80 Years' War is on, and so you have the Dutch Revolution. And in the various provinces that we would call Dutch by culture and by language, they revolt and they formally declare themselves independent in 1579. And the principle is that and this is really the first really secular state, even though it is Calvinist, but its main interests and goals are declared. Basically, we're not Spanish, we are Dutch. This is our national identity, explicitly out and proud, and we're going to take as much territory as we can to secure our provinces here. And so the 80 Years' War is on. It's going back and forth between the Spanish. Yeah, don't mention the Siege of Antwerp. I want to get into that, but I can't. So the Dutch have this notion of, we're Calvinist and we're going to rid the place of popery. So you see, for example, the cathedral in Utrecht, and you can see pictures of where all the images are whitewashed, statues. They're not completely effaced, but they do things. They cut the heads off. There's one image of a bishop preaching. They cut the head off the face out of the bishop, and they get rid of all the religious iconography, but they leave the pulpit there for preaching the word, because we like that. They did cut out the Eucharist and a priest offering mass. They take the head off. They do all these things, but they leave kind of the remnants of the image. So why leave it at all? And it's actually it's iconoclasm turned into art, really. And so what it is, and that's what a lot of graffiti in certain ways. It's like the iconoclasm is its own form of art, in as much as it's a medium communicating a message by desecrating a medium trying to communicate another message. In this case, they're saying our fathers were idolaters, but we are not. And, we have the purity of the gospel. That's what they're trying to say by what they've done. And they do this in other churches as well. Although there's still a lot of Catholics in the Dutch Republic that still live there and still function there. And they're basically tolerated for a while because they have to be. And so they fight the Spanish, and they develop various institutions of what it is to be Dutch. And so who is the stadtholder, for example, the Prince of Orange? And there's actually tension that goes on for a good number of years between the Prince of Orange and the other states of the Republic, in their fights in The Hague, and so much, where you have a couple of years where there's no stadtholder. William III, of England, who's first William of Orange, who's the stadtholder in the Dutch Republic. After his death in 1703, you go through another years where they try to prevent anyone related to the Orange family from being a stadtholder, right? So their notion is that we're free, and we're Protestant, right? So they strict Calvinism basically is the religion, but religion is kind of pushed away in public life. It's like we show our religion by living in a certain way. And so Calvinism is for the church. We go hear it on Sunday from the preacher, and then we go back out. And we go about our mercantile activities. A lot of people don't realize the Dutch had a worldwide empire. 1604 is the creation of the Dutch East India Company, which is the predecessor to the East India Company, and that as it becomes in England. And it's the first stock market, right? It's the first place where you raise funds from investors and bring things back to investors. And it's its own brand new thing. They even create banking, right? Or they don't create banking. They create the kind of central banking that we're familiar with now. And in a lot of different ways, this whole idea of having like a private bank that's also the bank of the government, and it issues the currency. It's the predecessor to the Bank of England. Actually, one of the guys who established the Bank of England, Patterson, he saw the workings of the Dutch central banks in Amsterdam, and he said, "Wow, we'll bring that over to England." So the
question for you though. So
Sure.
You're saying that the English become a theocracy, and they're growing the state. Do the Dutch sort of take it to the next level by sort of privatizing religion further, and just in terms of secular state?
Right. And even the artwork, you see the change in artwork. So you can see in other countrymen, you see other countrymen like Rubens, and Peter Paul Rubens, one of the very, greatest painters of that century and that epoch, actually, the most traded around Europe. And it's a high Baroque art. It's incredible work, and the details, the iconography, the various things that he does in his painting, whether he's telling mythological tales or things from scripture. He's always emphasizing the stoicism, that proper morality is found in doing what you're supposed to be doing what is commanded by Christ and the church in natural law, essentially. And so then you get to Rembrandt, or even Vermeer, as a Catholic in the Dutch Republic. And both of them, in the same way with different ends, are doing largely the same type of thing. So the lives of ordinary people, portraiture, scenes from the Old Testament that rather depict, people, as citizens rather than as, trying to get the right. So it's kind of desacralizing the religion. And so it's a very change in the notion. People now own artwork, actually. People have the artwork in their in their own home, which never happened before. Only royalty had artwork. Only royalty got portraits done. And because it's very wealthy, and so many people, there's a higher percentage of urban population in the United Provinces than in the Dutch Republic than anywhere else, really, in Europe. So more people own artwork, and now you're painting artwork for people. You're painting, portraiture. So you see kind of these shifts in Dutch society. You see little idiosyncrasies that express kind of this quiet Calvinism depicted in the lives of average people. So it's rather an interesting take. Whereas then you go to the Spanish Netherlands, which is the same type of culture. Dutch and Belgium really aren't that far off as languages. That is Flemish. Because in Belgium you have several different languages, by the way. So the Walloon and French is a big part of it, and whatnot. So Flemish, I'm speaking of Flemish and Dutch, close actually as languages. So, but there's a very different character because that's the Spanish Netherlands now, or Brabant, right? It's it's ruled over by some Habsburgs for a time, and later ends up being run alternative by the French, and then by other treaties and by the Protestants, and you have the King of the Netherlands take it over. So, I mean, we could go into that another time. So, Belgian Spanish culture is very different, still very, very peasant. It's not a high urban population. So their culture is very different under the Spanish. And they have, like, if you look at Peter Bruegel, for example, if you're familiar with the artwork of Peter Bruegel, tries to take the lives of average people and make half of it a mockery, half of it a joke, anti-clerical at a certain level because he mocks various levels of corruption in the church and so many things. So, but anyway, so we're going to get back to the secularization. So the Dutch Republic represents this absolute individualism, and you're citizens of the state, and you go about your job and your duty. It's very strongly Calvinist. There's a point where, like, Grotius, the famous philosopher that's Dutch, he's an Arminian. And so Arminians differ from Calvinists in as much as they accept free will. They believe in free will. And, where strict Calvinists deny free will altogether. So that was a huge dissension that it ended up causing, well, eventually Grotius was arrested at a certain point, and he had to be smuggled out in a box right out of his house, and he ended up living in exile in France. So these are kind of the ideas that change the nature of the state. So now it's individual. England still is theocracy with the king, but that's going to change as well. And so England is going to go through its transformation because Elizabeth has no heirs, and now the Stuarts come to the throne. So the Stuarts, James VI of Scotland, and he becomes James I of England. Now, James VI is raised as a strict Calvinist in the Scottish Kirk, right? So it's actually the Cathedral of St. Giles, which the Scots have now turned a similar thing to the Calvinists in Utrecht. All the images are gone, and they've even cut it up to, compartmentalized it in a different type of buildings and offices. And the main part of the church, you'll go and you'll hear the ministers. So they've established Calvin's notion of presbyters' councils, and which no bishops. And so the presbyters, the council works as a sort of magisterium, guiding each presbyter in announcing the faith and preaching the word of God, right? So James is raised by George Buchanan, who's one of the most able Latinists of that age, I might add, but strict Calvinist, beats him every day. And so James hates everything to do with Calvinism. And so he comes to the throne in England. He gets in there. Now he's in the Chapel Royal, far up high, and he's looking down. And there's the minister cowering as he's about to preach the sermon. So James goes native. He says, "I like this. This is great." So he becomes full out Anglican, and as opposed to the low church nature of the Scottish Kirk. That creates angst over in Scotland. So James has a number of children. The one that was supposed to reign, Henry IX, he dies, and so then you get Charles. Charles is imbibed very much everything from his father. So James creates the whole notion. He puts the idea of absolute monarchy, as it's been practiced in various places, in England especially. He puts it pen to paper, the law of free monarchies. You can find that in Google Books. It's actually an interesting read where he basically lays out all the propositions for why the monarch is judged by God alone and nobody else, not by a pope, not by any overmighty subject. The king is answerable to God alone. So Charles imbibes all this, and he even sees monarchy as a sacrament, right? When Archbishop Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is conducting the coronation of Charles I, And, he notes in his book how Charles is specifically carefully handling each object of monarchy and asking aloud to consecrate it, to rub with oil. So the entire office of king is so absolutely consecrated. It's like all the instruments are sacramentals, and that's how he's, absolutely above anything altogether. Well, Charles's reign doesn't turn out so well. James knew how to navigate the parliament in just the right way. Even when he was very unpopular, he still knew how to come out on top with that. Charles doesn't, and so there's a growing sense of, you could say, Republican sentiment in England, a growing sense of what the rights and liberties of Englishmen are. Some of it somewhat invented or enlarged upon older things and taken in a different context, but ultimately you've got more and more people, middle gentry and whatnot, that are saying, hey, we should have rights in this too. We should be able to be part of the legislative process. We should be able to, this whole theocracy bit, right? And the king having this absolute control over everything. Well, that seems to be against the rights of Englishmen. And actually it was. The whole Reformation in England is built in the back of violating Magna Carta.
Right, yeah.
Where the king says he's not going to interfere in the rights of the church. So this doesn't sit well. And it's interesting when you look back to Elizabeth's reign, and there's a certain Jesuit who was where he was sent to England with Campion, and he then when Campion was arrested, he left, and then he was never able to go back. He's mostly in Spain or in the Low Countries, but he's always writing back and forth with people and advancing ideas. So Robert Parsons, and Robert Parsons, it's spelled Persons, I believe it's pronounced Parsons though. And so what Parsons says is that the king needs to be held accountable by various bodies, including Parliament, and who becomes king should be also received by the will of the community. It doesn't just get his right just because. And what he's trying to advocate, he's trying to lay the grounds whereby the Catholics in England could demand that the Spanish Infanta, who supposedly would have some relation back to John of Gaunt or something like that, in terms of the Spanish line, she should be the queen, and not whoever Elizabeth's going to establish. And so because he's also relying heavily on Spanish aid. The Spanish don't have any real interest in England, but they love to see people play these games and whatnot to agitate the pot in England. So this is so he makes this kind of argument that the king should be subject to, in certain respects, Parliament, and to also the will of his own people. And it's interesting, these ideas were held as anathema, because Cecil and others under Elizabeth, they hold more toward absolute monarchy. But now things have switched around. So once you get into the 1620s and the Petition of Right, and you get into the 1630s during Charles's personal rule and the smoldering discontent over it, these same ideas that this Jesuit Persons is saying are now the same ideas that Protestants in England who hate the Catholic Church, and especially Jesuits, are saying, probably without even knowing it, actually. I don't think there's a direct influence, but they're coming to this conclusion when they're seeing this Protestant theocracy has been created. So you have all the things that create the English Civil War, which becomes essentially it's essentially over the rights of Parliament, the king's control of the army, and taxes.
Now, here's my question for that. So Cromwell leads the army and eventually has power.
Not at first, but yeah.
Oh, yes. So the Protectorate is a period of Republican rule in England. Now, is Cromwell a greater dictator, basically, than Charles at this point?
Far worse.
Why? So we have these two different powers, Republican and absolute monarchist, both Protestant. Why does the Republican get even worse?
It's a good question. Some of it's the bitterness of the Civil War itself, but really what it is some of it's religiously motivated, in as much as, so Cromwell was an independent, and the independent, so the Presbyterians, on the other hand, they held that, because they formed what they called the League and Covenant. And so that the League and Covenant of the Presbyterian religion needed a covenanting king, a king who would also sign this Presbyterian League and Covenant, right? The independents were not Presbyterians, although some of them had similar ideas in a lot of ways. They were very low church. They did not think there should be a state organized religion, right? So there should be no religion in the state that every man is required to subscribe to. And that's kind of an interesting thing, is Cromwell even meets with English gentry who are still Catholic. and even, accept certain petitions with them, except that he won't allow the mass or anything. But when he establishes some parliaments. So Cromwell's a late comer in the whole game. It was actually originally the biggest guy was Pym. And Pym is one of the big members pushing various conspiracy theories. Charles I is in league with the Pope to take away our Bibles and make us worship the Virgin Mary and all this kind of silliness, which wasn't so. But it adds to the pot really for the English Civil War. So he dies in the midst of it after he gets the Parliament to align with the Scots. And Cromwell's just a cavalry commander, but he's come from this this Calvinist stock where he's convinced that he was damned, and his family fortune as middle gentry had fallen, and he was even plowing his own fields, which is supposed to be beneath him. So now God has put his hand against him, and at some point after he overcomes an illness, he's convinced that God has actually willed his salvation, and so he is now amongst the elect. He is saved, anointed by God. And so when he joins the Civil War, he finds that the armies in the Civil War, he finds his purpose, like Gideon, to strike the enemies of the Lord and kill their kings. And that's very much in Cromwell's mindset. So it's one of the reasons why he pushes so hard for Charles I's execution. Now as Lord High Protector, and that's a complicated thing how he gets there too, but once he's there, he decides to let the Church of the Saints come about. And so parliaments will come together, and the people have no notion of what you even do in government. So they end up asking Cromwell to dissolve them because they're not even sure what they do, which he gladly does, and he just takes on the rule himself. So now the Puritans are basically demanding that Cromwell enact the life of the Church of the Saints. That is, we got to get rid of all vice and all sin. And so Cromwell then institutes the major generals, and their job is to, of course, outlaw Christmas, make sure nobody's celebrating Christmas unless it's done in a church service. That's absolutely verboten. Right. There's actually some cartoons from the era that show up, some pamphlets that show Father Christmas coming. And there's one of the major generals, one of Cromwell's men, dressed up and saying, we don't want you here. And the people are all begging, please, bring us cheer.
Yeah, so cancel. So he's the one who canceled Christmas.
Right,
he's
he
the
does.
First one to do it before it was
the first
cool.
one to do it. Exactly.
And it also
and everything else, vice, gambling, horse race, such staples of English life, even inns and brothels, all these are gone. Now forbidden. Marriage licenses are now checked. If a man and a woman are in bed together, you're liable to have some men come into your house to check your marriage license. And
so the theocracy goes seriously global, and then he also has the new model army too. The first real professional army.
So the eventually parliaments come at loggerheads with Cromwell because of his control of the army and taxes, just as they did with Charles I. The difference is Cromwell has an absolute command of that army, and there is no way that's going to change. That's going to be lessened. So, but it's all overwhelmingly secular, run by people of a certain religious bent, and that's really, you look at all the institutions and the laws crafted during the Republican rule in England, and it's not of a religious character. They de-established the church. And it's not done as a religious institution. It's done as a secular institution run by religious men. And you look at the changes of philosophy during the English Civil War, common men now fighting in the army, rising rank in the army, because as Cromwell had actually pushed for the idea of rank being determined by merit, not by your aristocratic standing, the way it was in the Royalist army. So by the, and you see there's an interesting thing that develops in the English Civil War, which is that you have, different characters like the levelers. The levelers believed in literally leveling, putting everyone on the same level, get rid of all aristocratic rank. And they're like a sort of proto-democrats in a lot of different ways. And you have other groups in philosophy. And of course, not everyone was willing to go that way as much as they were against the king. Not everyone was an anti-aristocrat. So you had the Putney debates between Henry Ireton, who's Cromwell's son-in-law, and several members, John Lilburne and people like that from the Levelers. And as they argue, it's really interesting to see those debates and see what the Levelers are saying. They're saying largely the same things that people say today, right? The idea of one person, one vote, the idea of just eliminating all aristocracy, that people that never would have looked a nobleman in the face are now advocating killing the nobleman. So it's an amazing change that's still with them, and of course during the Republican years. And so I made some tweet the other day that was humorous, because I was actually thinking about some of this in preparation for today, and I was like, Cromwell saved Christmas by dying, because he had very effectively outlawed Christmas for several years, and so all those people growing up would have never known Christmas, or scarcely known it. And that would have been the majority. If Cromwell lived for another generation and managed to continue enforcing that, then Christmas would have ceased to exist in England.
So
by dying, he saved it.
Oh, the Puritans. And
that changes. All right, go ahead with your question.
I was just going to bring us to 1688. So you have the Restoration. Okay.
Right.
There's a certain amount of restoration of culture with obviously the restoration of Christmas. Right. Does the secularization continue? I know that there's obviously the Catholic. So it continues to become secular even as Charles II converts on his deathbed. James II, a Catholic, rules England for a very short time. And then the Dutch secularization melds with the English in 1688. So tell us about the secularization in this final period.
Okay. So this final period for the English is like this. So you have the English Republic. It falls apart after Cromwell's death. Even though it seems to transition well enough, Cromwell's son Richard takes over as the Lord High Protector. He gets congratulations even from France and other countries that recognize him as the Lord High Protector and whatnot. Then, so it's smooth as a transition as you could possibly want. But then, very quickly, Richard was not like his father. He didn't have the iron will, didn't have the full command of the army. The army tried to use him to move, in different ways, and so he decided rather than cause any trouble or that anyone should die on his account, he decides to resign because he realizes he just can't handle or manage the situation. And then, contemporary historians derisively call this the rule of Queen Dick. So anyway, so then you get Monk. So Monk was a general, was Cromwell's right-hand man. He was a royalist that switched sides, and Cromwell put absolute trust and faith in him. So he realized there's only one way to restore any kind of unity or semblance to England, and that's to bring the monarchy back. And so Charles II, the son of Charles I, he's living in exile in the Netherlands at Breda, and he is, is raised by his father. He's got a sense. He's very sharp politically. He's very tall, where his father is very short. There is what's the saying? I can't remember which English historian put this saying on Charles II, whereas his father was very rigid in all things. The only thing rigid about Charles II was his male member, famously fathering, like 17 or 18 bastard children through different mistresses and stuff, and he would be very prolific. And actually, we'll get into some of that too, for how that secularizes. But in the meantime, he is, living in the Netherlands, and he gets this message that that it's time to come back. We're inviting you back, and so he brokers a deal with Monk that his father's executioners will be punished, but nobody else, just the guys who actually did the deed and made it happen. So they agree to that, and so he issues the Decree of Breda, which says that we're going to have religious differences, and that was the problem that caused the whole the Civil War. So now we're going to have religious toleration, and that's actually a complicated concept, religious toleration. So because you have from the medieval standpoint that the state should be a confessional state and should absolutely not allow differences of religion to exist in the body politic in any way, shape, or form. So the notion that there's a way to tolerate it, but not absolutely allow it, because you can't do evil so good would come of it, so you can't publicly uphold an evil. And actually Bellarmine says this very same thing in his response to a Hungarian prince who wanted to just have full out freedom of religion for everybody in Hungary, and because the Hungarians tended to favor the Lutherans, and sometimes even in their stuff fighting against the Turks and whatnot. So problem being, for Charles coming into this situation, said, religious toleration along the board, we want that, and then we'll have peace. So he gets back into England. He goes through to executing the guys who are directly responsible. Shows a lot of mercy. Actually, if you can give me just a minute, I'm noticing my battery's running low. I have to plug this in, or else I'm going to disappear.
Oh, yeah, no problem. So just to give everybody some basic framework here. So Charles II comes to restore, and then we have James II later, who is actually a Catholic, and we're talking about William of Orange later, who comes from the Netherlands to become the king as a usurper, and that is the context actually for John Locke and what he writes to actually justify the usurpation of the throne.
There we go.
So here we have the whole context crystallizing with the American Revolution 100 years later.
We do. So Charles gets in, and now he finds this problem that, he's still got a fairly divided country. There's a lot of people that really aren't happy the monarchy's back, even though there's been all this public cheering, and the traditional challenge was given after the coronation. If anyone doubts the knight of the stool comes out, throws down the gauntlet, and it says, anyone will challenge his right to rule, let him be heard. Nobody. It's almost like Cromwell and the Civil War never happened. It's like the temporary feeling, but then reality sets in, and so that's why Charles goes to war abroad. He goes to war against the Dutch, actually, and but a number that makes people even less content, because usually when you have problems at home, you go to war abroad to bring unity. This didn't really bring a lot of unity for Charles, because a lot of Englishmen felt that they should be fighting for the Dutch against the French, not for the French against the Dutch. And, and you have things of that sort that come in. And then Charles marries a Catholic. This will actually come as a bigger problem later. He marries Catherine of Braganza, who's from Portugal. And that marriage ends up not being fruitful. A child miscarries, and then she's never able to, she has to have her uterus removed. So she never has children. And this is a huge, problem for Charles. So now the heir to the throne is his brother. Now Charles had his own encounter with Catholicism after the Battle of Dunbar. So he had come back from Europe to Scotland, swore the Scottish Covenant, the Presbyterian Covenant, and went to go invade England. So Cromwell comes back from Ireland to meet Charles at Dunbar, where he smashes the Scots army, and Charles flees, and he's taken in by some Catholics and put in a priest hole with a Jesuit. Which was a good thing back then, not a bad thing. And so he, it's for the father. I believe the name was Fitzjames. I might be mistaken. And he starts explaining to Charles the truth of the Catholic religion. Charles is really interested. His mother was a Catholic. He has far more sympathy with Catholicism than he does with Protestantism. And so he says that, if he's ever in power, he'll make sure to improve the lot of Catholics. And the Edict of Toleration at Breda was very much along the lines of what he wanted to produce. But this creates the problem that the Anglican Church is not in the mood for toleration. The people, the diehard supporters who were Anglicans, they said, no, we fought and died. And the Anglican churchmen and whatnot, we fought and died for the established church. We're not going to let this toleration happen. And so they revoke it. So Charles is forced to revoke the Edict of Toleration because he can't lose his allies in the Anglican Church. And that, because that would be too much of a problem for him. He probably might have converted, except that he recognized there's no way he could possibly convert to Catholicism and maintain his throne. So he stays as a Protestant. He does what he can for Catholics still. But then in the midst of that, you have the Titus Oates plot. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Okay, so Titus Oates is about 5'2", ugly and very homosexual. And he was drummed out of the Navy for buggering an officer. He tried to become an Anglican clergyman. He was kicked out. So he goes abroad under a feigned conversion to Catholicism. And he gets frog-marched out of no less than 3 Jesuit seminaries for homosexuality. It's back when they got you out instead of making you a cardinal. But anyway.
Yeah, we've got to laugh so we don't cry at that one.
I know, unfortunately. So he goes back to England with an animus against Catholics and Jesuits in particular. So he sees the religious discontent. So now James, the king's brother, the Duke of York, he has become a Catholic abroad. He just straight up converted to Catholicism. And with the gynecological situation of his queen, James is the heir to the throne. So this means that a Catholic is going to inherit the throne. And people start thinking about this. And the Whigs start thinking about it, Locke's party and all. And they say, yeah, this is really a big problem. So you get to the seclusion crisis. And that's usually how I think that would title it in history books. The seclusion crisis, whether to seclude James from the throne in favor of, there were 2 camps. One said that Charles II's bastard son, the Duke of Monmouth, should be allowed to inherit to become king, except the Duke of Monmouth was very badly bred, ill-mannered, not at all the type of person that a lot of people felt comfortable with. So what about James's Protestant daughter, Mary? What about her? And that's kind of where the majority of the Whig camp, and that's also where those terms come in, by the way, Whig and Tory. And Whig was, I forget, there's one of them is an Irish term for a cattle thief. The other one for a cuckold, and I can't remember which one is which actually at the moment. But it's funny too that the English are going for Irish and Scottish Gaelic for terms to use, for abusive terms to use against the other party. So the Tory party is basically the Anglican party, the established church party. The monarchy is preserved and primogeniture is preserved and so on and so forth. And the Whigs are kind of your libertarian party, your very liberal, freedom from the monarchy, freedom, from religion and of religion and so on and so forth. So, and ultimately, so the crisis that comes down to this, James is Catholic, so that's a threat to all of it. And also because it represents further alliance with France, which the Whigs did not like. The Whigs wanted alliance with the Dutch or with others. And so Titus Oates steps into this and he catches the scene. So he goes before a magistrate and swears that there is a conspiracy of Catholics to kill the king and put James on the throne, which is ridiculous because he's already going to go on the throne. But it hits that one vibe, the one English national prejudice of anti-Catholicism, aggravated by the gunpowder plot. And, Guy Fawkes and all that bit. It's still in the mind of Englishmen. Here we are 70 years later. And that prejudice and that fear they're able to play upon, because it was played upon very much during the English Civil War, right? So now, once again, Catholics are invading the country. The Jesuits are everywhere, and then before you know it, they're going to take away your Bibles and make you worship the Virgin Mary, and Protestants will be burning. So you had the Fire of London, right? And this is a major game changer in English culture too, at least as far as the southern segment goes. Is you have this fire in London, totally destroys London, so they go in these massive rebuilding projects to rebuild the city. So they put a tower commemorating the fire, and also commemorating Charles and James and their work to free people in the city and so on, and to stop the fire and whatnot. So these pamphlets rang out, and it's actually the very first time we find in English history the phrase Bloody Mary, talking about Queen Mary Tudor, by the way. Because the actual legacy of Queen Mary is after Elizabeth. Elizabeth can only rule because Mary ruled first. Mary breaks down all the stereotypes of queenship. She's a virgin. She's known to be a virgin. So that's the biggest thing you can throw against a woman in the rule of sexual impropriety. You can't throw that against Mary. Whereas Elizabeth actually was a little suspect. Because the Duke of Somerset, in that particular affair, not Somerset, Seymour, that had married Catherine Parr, Henry's widow. So Elizabeth wasn't keen to blacken Mary's memory, and a lot of Protestants actually remembered her as Good Queen Mary. It was her name when she was reigning, because she was so distributed alms so freely. So once you get and then forgotten after the reign of Elizabeth, she's entirely forgotten. But then you get to even in spite of Fox's Book of Martyrs and things like that, So then you get to this pamphlet that starts running around, and they say that remember the fire of London. Now imagine new fires, except they're Protestants, burning now as torches, just as Protestants burned in the reign of Bloody Mary. And this really hits a chord, and people are really nervous. So a magistrate starts interviewing people, and they strike lucky. They get this one Catholic nobleman who'd written to Louis XIV about the possibility of converting England. So they say, prima facie evidence of a Catholic conspiracy theory. And of course, the guy was really just as much of a dreamer as Titus Oates, right? So this conspiracy theory now seems to have its evidence, and it keeps moving. And it's really, a big source of mass delusion. All sorts of innocent Catholics are killed as part of this plot. And then innocent people are taken in with it. And basically Oates and his group, they just start making stuff up. And judges start issuing arrest warrants. And the Whigs have their full political support behind it. So Charles is in this really weak position because the monarchy can't fund itself anymore. It's dependent on grants from Parliament. And in the parliamentary elections are returning more and more Whigs, and so this is just getting really nasty. A lot of martyrs from the Titus Oates plot, by the way. And you look up martyrs of the Titus Oates plot, or actually I think it's a section under English martyrs if you look in various entries for it. So what happens in the end is actually this other fellow named Samuel Pepys. And historians of this period, if you know this period well, you know who Samuel Pepys is. He was an archivist, librarian. He was Secretary of the Navy at one point. He was a major writer in this period and had various dealings with the court. Well, he gets accused. And because he had issued an arrest warrant for some weird guy that showed up in some county or whatever, it turned out to be a partisan of the Whigs and the whole Oates plot. And so they decided to go after Pepys, because he's also, has a relationship with James, the Duke of York, so is a client of his, and so they go after Pepys. Now Pepys has a lot of good standing, and he has a lot of evidence that he can marshal at his disposal. He's the first one to actually beat Oates's accusers, and the judge got Judge Scroggs, and he'd been behind this 100%. Now all of a sudden he starts rethinking it. No, not so much sympathy for the poor fools he's put to death, but he keeps, so then he overturns the whole plot. And then Charles senses the change. Charles II senses the change of the mood, and the whole Oates plot seems to roll to a stop. At the same time, then the Whigs get desperate, and they try to assassinate Charles and James, and they're both riding in a coach. And so then that gave Charles everything he needed. Whiggism is declared treason, and Toryism is declared the right way. And of course, just in time, Christopher Wren's finished the construction of the new St. Paul's, which is powerfully Anglican, classical, beautiful, the exact opposite of Low Church. And so this really changes the political situation for Charles. And so Oates this whole thing just kind of fizzles out. James even sues him in court and wins a libel charge. Then the Whigs are still agitating for the seclusion of James. So Charles finishes it off. A famous scene, he goes into Parliament. He really becomes Hobbes's Leviathan. He goes into the Parliament dressed in his royal coronation robes, which he rarely wears, and then compares the Whigs to Cromwell and the actors of the Civil War. And that scares people. You don't want that again, do you? Because people remember how terrible it was and how absolutely awful all of England turning into an armed camp was. And so now the Whigs are intrinsically associated with this idea of treason and civil war and such. And so he declares there'll be no more talk of seclusion, and he dissolves Parliament, and that's it. In the background, he's taking money from Louis XIV so he can afford to dissolve Parliament, because Louis XIV is trying to direct that outcome of keeping England out of the continental struggles, or at least keeping them on his side. So that's kind of how the mood sets. Under Charles, you also have the rise of, for example, the Royal Academy of the Sciences, which Robert Hooke is the leader, the head of, and then eventually that comes to Newton, who will be the head of it. The scientific discovery is coming around, and all these things put the backdrop. And what's really happened is that English society is not Catholic, and it's not Protestant. It's a secular society made up of a majority of Protestants. And that's the fact of it already in Charles's reign. And then you get to James, but he's Catholic. And so all the old bugaboos come out, but they would have tolerated those, except that James had a son. His new wife, Mary of Modena, she has a son, James Francis Edward. Now Catholics will rule forever. We can't have that. So they have to. So that's when the glorious revolution, so-called, begins. Although they don't call it glorious in Scotland, from what I understand. But it's. William III decided to get rid of a whole clan because they wouldn't accept him. So that's. But anyway, so what happens is you got an elite in English society, including Winston Churchill's ancestor, John Marlborough, who the Duke of Marlborough. And he's a major figure in the War of Spanish Succession, actually, so he'll get a lot of fame later as a general. But he's one of kind of the Whig elite that invite William of Orange, the stadtholder in Holland, to come over to England and become king. And William doesn't want to be king. William wants to make James, because James is his father-in-law. He's married to James's daughter, Mary, a Protestant child of James. And so he wants James to switch his policy from supporting the French to supporting the Dutch. And so James, fearing the worst, betrayals all around. He throws the royal seal in the sea, and then he crosses the Thames and goes under French protection. So he crosses the Channel, goes under French protection. And so the Louis XIV sets him up at a court in Saint-Germain. There's a quick attempt for him to try to recover England, and it fails. The Battle of the Boyne, actually a major battle in Ireland, worthy of study if you want to get into the military history in that one. But so James is kind of out. Now William is in, and so they offer William the crown, and since James is gone, he decides to take it kind of reluctantly because he's not really interested in England. So what happens is that now William is the king and kind of an elective monarch temporarily, because it's under the condition that Parliament, he has to ratify all these things in Parliament. He has to start giving up a lot of royal prerogatives. And then there's John Locke, actually, writes the Act of Settlement and the Act of Succession. So the Act of Succession makes it so no Catholic or anyone married to a Catholic can ever become king. Why? Well, the ostensible reason is that James is still living in France, and his son, James Francis Edward, can come back and claim the crown, and we'll be right back what we just got rid of, Catholic kings. We can't have that. So Catholicism now is viewed by the English as arbitrary government, tyrannical government, just the very fact of its existence, because it's under the Pope, who's the Antichrist, of course. You know?
Right, yeah.
So, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of that. But, so William comes in, and technically the Anglican Church is a certain way. He doesn't interfere with it, but he also more or less gives a certain degree of religious toleration, except for Catholics, because he's a low church Protestant, and he's also homosexual, and so he has no heirs. So his wife married, obviously doesn't have any children. Purcell, who's one of the greatest musical geniuses that England's ever produced, he actually did the coronation music for James's coronation, which is great, some of it. He wrote some amazing pieces for William III as birthday presents for Queen Mary II. So if you want to look those up just for awesome music, it's definitely worth doing. So under this place, so you have London, even in the low areas out in the country and away from London, away from the major city areas, a lot of life continues as it did. People go to church. Now it's the Anglican Church or maybe a Presbyterian church or whatever. You do have some Catholic recusants, not well tolerated yet. It's another 50 years before you start seeing Catholic toleration start to take an uptick in England. But the note of government as such is now secular, and religion is kind of the veneer, and it's run by religious people. But you see that in the 19th century. So William III goes to war against Louis XIV. You have the War of the First Coalition. Then you have the War of Spanish Succession, absolutely devastating war, devastates France in pieces. And he's spilling English blood to keep it. And then you have under the Hanoverians, because you can't have any Catholics or Catholic married to a Catholic coming to the throne. So you have to go all the way to Hanover to find a pure Protestant, Georg of Hanover. And he comes over. He's not interested in England at all. He doesn't even bother learning English. And so, but his family then runs, and you have George II that begrudgingly speaks a little bit of English once in a while. Most of the time speaks German. But, his interests are all on the continent. So English blood is now being spilled on the continent. And, mostly for anti-French policy, principally. And then the trophies of this are being put in the churches. So the Anglican Church is now a national church. It's an expression of the state itself, the state religion. So you go into a lot of Anglican churches, especially in urban areas. What do you find? Union Jacks. You find, I'm not talking about country church here and there, but in the cities and whatnot, even St. Paul's to a certain extent, you have statues of poets. You have statues of people who are felt to have conferred much upon English culture, or the English heroes Byron, and so on and so forth. Lord Admiral Nelson is buried in the crypt of St. Paul's in Henry VIII's casket. Right. There's an interesting story behind that, but that's where Nelson is. Nelson was a bigamist and abandoned his own family for Lady Carlisle, and only was begrudgingly allowed. And he's one of those guys. If he had lived, he would have been universally hated and loathed. But he died at just the right time and at the most heroic moment at Trafalgar, where now he's remembered as this national hero. He died at the right time to become a hero. He's in the crypt of St. Paul's, because now it's part of this kind of national religion of such. Although on the other hand, if they were Catholic churches, who knows what kind of clown circus they might have been turned into. So there's that. Sadly,
so the secularizing comes to a great apex in the so-called glorious revelation, right. The ugly revolution of 1688.
Right.
And Locke writes his writings, which are sort of formulating, which
he
has
becomes
the influence.
More influential in the Whig Party is now in the ascendant, and that affects everything in the colonies. That affects everything, and it also sets the tone of the language. 1688 and 1641, the beginning of the English Civil War. Both of those occasions set the ideas in the language that's all used. And why were the founding fathers scared of standing armies? Because the Stuarts had standing armies, and all the propaganda they're borrowing from in 1688 is based on guys who were afraid of the Stuarts having standing armies to defend themselves when they came back when the Restoration happened. A lot of the other language, even religious toleration and such, is born out of that period. Where in this case, that they create a secular theocracy, right? And Parliament or Congress will make no law respecting religion, and so it's declaring itself to work in this secular thing. The secular government is doing what English government has been doing, really. Just putting a name and a term to it. And so in all governments around the year, all monarchs around the world at this point, they're kind of following in, it's like a slow cultural pace that's just, drifting, as we go and gradually increasing, like coalescing, and more aware of it as you get into the 18th century and the 19th century, especially. So like in Spain, we barely really talked about Spain. It continues to decline. So the Battle of Huaqua in the end of the 30 Years' War, that's the major battle of the Spanish. The last goes. There's a great painting of it called the Last Tercio. All right, the Spanish Tercio is the unit that dominated the battlefield. Well, the French defeated at Huaqua, and that's the end of Spanish dominance. And Spain becomes the sick man of Europe, monarch upon monarch, and then you get the War of Spanish Succession, where Charles III of Spain, Charles II of Spain, I'm sorry, he dies childless. And so the Cortes votes to give the country to someone in Louis XIV's family. And Louis XIV looks at this prospect and says, oh, wow, damned if I do, and I'm damned if I don't, because he knows that if he accepts and gets one of his relatives to sit on the throne of Spain, that William of Orange is going to unite the Habsburgs and the Dutch and all these unlikely groups of alliances against him, because everyone feels he's too powerful. And if he has Spain as well as France, that'll be even worse. On the other hand, if he does it, the Habsburgs will get it, and now he'll be fighting, with the Habsburgs on two fronts, just like back in the 16th century. So he says, what the hell? I'll roll the dice. What are we going to get? Oh, I guess we're going to war, no matter what we do. So he puts his cousin on the throne of Spain, and which begins the reign of the Spanish Bourbons. Like the Spanish Bourbons in Naples, for example, are descended from this. And then William III says, that's it, we're going to war. And of course, he ends up dying before the whole thing can start, because he's riding his horse one day and it stepped into a molehill and it threw William of Orange off, and he broke his clavicle and he died. Right. And so hence comes the Scottish toast to the little fellow in black velvet. But
I don't know how to wrap this up. I don't even know what to say. I mean,
I don't know either, actually.
We've covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for all the detail and encyclopedic knowledge. Any final thoughts on secularism as we face COVID-1984 canceling Christmas, like Cromwell?
Right. Yes, that's right. Well, power abhors a vacuum. And so in the Middle Ages, we mentioned how everyone kind of had their place, and every institution had its place, and the state gradually garnered more power to itself. And with the Reformation, it paved the way for how to break the church out of any governing role in society. And so again, nature abhors the vacuum. So as soon as you get rid of the church, at least a real church, because you could say England, but the Anglican Church, they could have no one darken their doors, ever again, and they have the endowments to continue. So, but anyway, the state becomes its own religion without a force to affect and control the members of the state. So in previous ages where things get very secular, you have religious men governing a secular nation. And that seems to keep a level of moral restraint, and it keeps certain things in check to a certain point. You look in the 19th century, Protestants run the government, but we still have horrible acts of bloodshed like the Mexican-American War, which was entirely, instigated on this side of the Rio Grande,
right?
And with all sorts of atrocities that we committed down there. And the War of 1812, when we couldn't beat the British regulars in Canada, so American soldiers started instructed to kind of commit terrorism along the Chesapeake. And they started burning down Canadian towns and whatnot, because all their invasions got beat back by the British. And most people don't realize when the British burned down the White House, it's actually in revenge for Americans burning down the Canadian State Building. So and anyway, you look, it's bad things were still done without and bad things were done in Christendom. and bad things, so there's human nature that's still involved there. But what happens is unique once the state becomes entirely secular with no influence of the church, is that you still need that religious element. And if there isn't one, you'll create one. And so the state is largely its own religion, a modern state anyway. And it has to have, religious fervor. There's certain words that take on sacramental, meaning democracy, elections, freedom. Certain things that become all things to all men, but they're now like consecrated phrases and sacred words. Government is now a sacred office and a sacred trust. You have your processions, right? You're with your saints' relics, your founding fathers, whatnot.
Right.
You have your scripture, your constitution. You have all these types of things, and then government basically becomes the religious activity. You look at this last election. You look at either the left or the right, and I would rather Trump won, actually, even though at a certain level, I think they're largely the same with a different veneer and different language and one or two things that might be done good by this one or that one. But ultimately, you look at the left, it's absolutely religious, but it's a secular religion. It's a secular humanism of sorts, and so the religious fervor with which they believe that they need an inquisition to wipe out everybody that doesn't agree with them. Even the actual Inquisition didn't do anything like that. Right. The actual Inquisition, like you had to literally write down a list of your enemies. And if one person on that list was your accuser, they threw the whole case out, even if it had merit. Fat chance seeing that happen from top cop Kamala, when she becomes president. We can all be choked out by black lady cops now. But it's, and also in Europe, too. I mean, especially since World War II and the increasingly secular nature, the government is like a sort of religion. And it doesn't matter. Now they're going to declare what's true from on high, like God. And we've seen that with the media. That's just the organ. It's all controlled by like 6 people. Governments all move into the same tune. So basically a state that's not restrained by a combination of virtue and actual religion, which gives, like Pius XI teaches, gives the life soul to the state. It doesn't mean that, if we create a confessional state, that now we have to force everyone to be Catholic, right? Well, no, that's one of the things we've learned in the history and the wars and, from Westphalia and onward, you can actually have toleration that's not approval and also not coercion, and for the good of civil society, wherever the good of civil society merits it. And that's true with a lot of sins that are publicly done. You don't need to go punish these sins because we're now in a confessional state, unless they're really against natural law and common law. But, where they affect everybody in a certain way. Certain things are against natural law, but not necessarily common law. We can get into that in another episode or something like that. But so essentially, that would be kind of my thought, is that the state becomes bloody. It was, there's always a certain amount of bloodshed. There's always a certain amount of violence in history, but nothing like we've seen, especially since when do the gloves come off? When do we no longer have particularly religious men guiding the reins of a secular government and move over to more or less secular or religion and name only men governing, the late 19th century. It's the Boer War and all these horrible wars around the world, and then World War I. And then World War II, which everything just seems to crescendo in the amount of horror. And you see, state-sponsored eugenics and exterminating people and communism and stuff. And so I think that's the thing, is that the only thing preventing things in the past was that with the secularism is you had religious people in a secular state that could only go so far. Now you don't have that even that much. So exterminating a whole population, didn't matter to the British. And when they were run by by largely irreligious people, well, in this country is a similar thing.
Wow, that's absolutely, it's a great lesson for us all. We don't know where we're going to go from here, but that'll be the subject of future shows. So thank you so much, Ryan, for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge with us.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
So once again, take a look at the link below. Check out Mediatrix Press. Subscribe to the book club. Get your new hardcover from Mediatrix Press every month. Also, check out the new Christmas presents coming down the pike from Ryan's Latinist knowledge as well, translating Bellarmine and such. Do you have anything promotion? Were you just grabbing a promotion or not?
Yeah, the one I want to grab is on the other side. So I have to get up and make a big mess. And so I did just do a book, They Lived the Faith, which is a reprint of a book written around the 1950s. Lay Catholics in the 19th century who fought actually a good deal secularism, communism, and socialism, and trying to preserve Catholic social teaching. I did an interview on that with the guy who wrote the foreword for it, Michael Greaney. So it's actually a wonderful book, well written, by short biographies of all these particular people, as diverse as Daniel O'Connell, who got Catholic emancipation in Ireland, and I'm just trying to think of some others. Lindhorst, who fought against Bismarck and the Kulturkampf. Blessed Pauli Marie Jericho, who fought for the rights of workers and the poor, but also fought communism and socialism too. And it's a really good book because it puts in a context those who first fought for Catholic action and also fought communism and socialism at the same time. So it's not it's not to fight capitalism you have to become a socialist. It's not that everyone subscribing to church social teaching is a communist or a socialist. It's actually an aberration.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great book for us to meditate on as we contemplate what we're dealing with and what to do next.
Precisely.
So definitely a subject for future shows. So thanks so much, Ryan. Let's offer up an Our Father for this secular world we're living in and what we're going to do next. So
absolutely.
Wisdom from God to how to rule our families and our neighborhoods of families and our cities to try to create some space where Christ can reign first in our own souls and in our family. So check out Mediatrix Press below. Let's offer up an Our Father. In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater noster, qui es in caeli, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos debitimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
Amen.